There are myths that arrive like storms, beginning not with thunder but with the hush before it, and the story of Medusa begins in that silence, where the sea meets the rock and gods move like weather. She is born into a family the old poets describe with names like Phorcys and Ceto, figures of the deep whose lineage reads like a map of the sea's shadows. In some tellings she emerges as one of three sisters, Gorgons with names that clack harshly on the tongue, Steno, Euryale, and Medusa, and in the oldest threads of the tale it is only Medusa who can die, only she who will walk the thin line between mortal frailty and monstrous form. Medusa's story starts quiet, then hits like a storm. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what draws you more, her human side or the monster she became. The earliest poets imagined the Gorgons as creatures of old earth, winged and bronze-handed, their faces raw and terrible, their mouths set with fangs, their hair already serpents coiled and alive. Hesiod lays them out on the page like geology, a feature of the world's underside made person, daughters of primordial sea and salt. But the picture shifts as stories are retold around hearths and in halls. Once, in later voices, Medusa is not born monstrous but blessed with a beauty that turns eyes toward her like migrating birds. It is in those later voices that the story picks up a different light, the light of stone and of places of worship, where gods and people intersect. Medusa becomes a maiden, and not merely a face in a crowd but a priestess in Athena's temple, pledged to a life of sacred service and vows that mark her as chosen, set apart from the ordinary rhythms of marriage and household. This image matters because it sets the stage for a betrayal that is both intimate and cosmic. A temple is a place of law, and when law bends it snaps in public ways. Poseidon enters the tale like a current that has been always under the surface, a god who belongs to the sea and to desire, who moves between sanctuaries and open water, who needs and takes. In Ovid's telling, the version that has shaped how many of us picture Medusa, Poseidon violates her within Athena's shrine, and that crime reverberates not only through Medusa's life but through the moral geometry of the gods. The act is violent in the human sense, and its ripples are made divine by being anchored inside a temple, a place where the human and the immortal are supposed to meet under rules. What follows is the stubborn logic of myth. The victim becomes the visible instrument of the gods' discontent, and Athena's vengeance falls upon Medusa's head rather than upon the violation. Athena, affronted that her sacred precinct has been sullied, transforms Medusa's hair into writhing serpents and makes her face a weapon that petrifies any who look directly upon it. It is a punishment that reverses roles, a transfiguration that turns beauty into danger, desire into hazard, and the promise of sanctuary into a site of exile. To hear how that transformation is described is to feel the cold of rock forming in the throat. The hair hisses and becomes a living crown, each strand a snake that turns and tastes the air, alive in a way that makes the human impossible. The eyes, once windows of expression, become instruments of cessation, where one glance freezes lovers, soldiers, gods. The change is precise and theatrical, an image made to be remembered and to be feared, and yet it carries with it a tragic logic. A woman is made into a monster and then must live the rest of her days bearing the mark of the gods' quarrel. Across retellings, this act of divine justice sits uneasily because the mechanism of punishment does not track the moral agency of the actors. Poseidon's transgression is often left unpunished in the myths, while Medusa, the violated, is marked forever. That asymmetry has kept the story alive in rooms where people talk about power. It presses on listeners because it reads like a law of spectacle. The visible body becomes the ledger on which divine disputes are settled, and those who bear visibility pay. The sense that the gods' quarrels are adjudicated on human flesh makes the story a parable of vulnerability and arbitrariness. Still, the older traditions do not always present Medusa as originally beautiful. Some strands say the Gorgons were always monstrous, daughters of sea and ancient horror, and that Medusa's mortality is the strange hinge of the tale because the other two sisters live beyond time. In those versions, the curse is not a transformation from beauty to terror, but part of a family biography of fright, where the world already contains beings meant to guard thresholds and scare away the unworthy. Such variability in the myths shows how cultures rewrite origins to suit their anxieties, and Medusa becomes a mirror that reflects whatever the teller fears most. There is etymology here that is suggestive even if not definitive. Some scholars see the name Medusa as related to words for guarding or protecting, a guardian lady, which would make the ironic twist of her becoming monstrous more pointed. Imagine a figure whose name implies protection turned into a ward against humanity, whose face repels the world instead of embracing it. In that light, Medusa's role as apotropaic, that is, a thing that wards off evil, becomes more intelligible, for to be feared is sometimes to be placed at the hinge of safety and terror. The ancient world often placed frightening visages on shields and temple gables, and the Gorgonian, the stylized head of a Gorgon, appears on pottery, armor, and architecture like a repeating talisman. People put that sharp-eyed face on breastplates and doorways because the idea of petrifying danger could also protect. A gaze that turns the enemy to stone becomes a way to keep danger at a distance. There is a strange democracy in that image. The same face that could annihilate is also worn by soldiers and shopkeepers to fend off the little daily evils we do not name in mythic terms. This dual nature of Medusa, monster and protector, sits at the heart of what the curse does. Athena's response, while cruel, is also curiously administrative. Instead of visiting Poseidon's violence upon the sea god, she transforms the situation into a permanent, public mark. She takes something private and makes it a spectacle that belongs to everyone, as if to say that sacred spaces cannot be sullied without the world knowing. But that knowledge comes with a cost. The silencing of Medusa's own story beneath the weight of legend and the gaze of those who will tell it for generations. When Perseus appears in the narrative, he is the mortal hand that will close the loop by beheading Medusa, and his approach reframes the curse as both fate and opportunity. Perseus, favored by gods who lend him winged sandals, a reflective shield, and a helmet of invisibility, becomes the instrument by which the petrifying gaze is neutralized and turned into an object to be carried, Medusa's severed head. The image of the hero carrying the Gorgon's head is an unsettling one, a trophy that confounds life and death and transforms a punishment into a prize. The method by which Perseus triumphs matters. He does not look at her directly. Instead, he uses Athena's polished shield as a mirror, so that he sees Medusa's reflection and not the thing itself. The narrative is careful here. Reflection is trick, craft is survival, and the shield is a device that turns the curse's own logic against it. There is irony in that Athena, who cursed Medusa, is also the one who provides the means by which the curse is exploited and the monster subdued, which complicates her role as purely vindictive. From Medusa's severed neck, myth tells us, two children spring, Pegasus, a horse winged like the sudden flare of a divine idea, and Chrysaor, a man with a golden blade in his name. Their births from blood and death invert the normal sequence of generative time and make the severed head a source of life as well as of horror. This motif, life arising from violence, reverberates elsewhere in myth, but here it reads like an insistence that endings are never entirely final and that transformations continue to weave out of rupture. Art and poetry have chewed on this contradiction for centuries because the image stays with you, a beautiful woman turned into a monster, her head later worn as a shield, children born out of brutality, a hero carrying a head like a talisman. In vase paintings and on temple metopes, Medusa's face is both grotesque and oddly aestheticized, eyes wide, tongue lolling, snakes framing a visage that is meant to shock and to enthrall. The tension between symmetry and horror, between ornament and omen, is what keeps artists returning to her, she is the perfect subject for questions about beauty, ugliness, and the line between them. Medusa's story also sits at the crossroads of the sacred and the profane in ways that invite different social readings. The priestess who is violated in a sanctuary strikes at a society's sacred heart, and such a violation often requires a public explanation or response in ancient myths, which is why gods enact visible punishments. But if the punishment transforms the victim rather than the transgressor, the social implications are darker. It suggests mechanisms by which societies silence victims by making them the spectacle that explains the upset, a theme that modern interpreters cannot ignore. In modern times, Medusa has become a figure onto whom many project their concerns about misogyny, power, and reclamation. Feminist readings have reframed the narrative as an account of punishment directed at female autonomy. And artists and writers have argued that the curse is not only unjust but revealing of how patriarchal institutions manage transgression. Medusa, in these takes, is not merely a monster but a martyr, a symbol of righteous rage whose very face is a warning against further violence. That transformation from monster to emblem of resistance is itself a story of cultural reclamation. Poets and novelists have written new versions where Medusa speaks, resists, and explains, where the victimized woman is not reduced to the function of object lesson in divine morality. In such retellings, her curse becomes an opening, a site where language can examine injustice rather than reproduce it, and her serpentine hair becomes a motif of resilience as much as of horror. These modern retellings are part of a lineage in which myth bends to human concern, and the old stories are reshaped by new ethics. Yet the ancient usage of Medusa's face as a protective emblem complicates these modern appropriations because the past also shows that fear can be harnessed for safety. The same image that terrorizes also shields. The Gorgonian appears on shields, coins, and temple pediments because it was believed to avert harm while announcing power. To hold up Medusa's face was to declare that one was protected by a fearsome watchfulness, that those who looked with ill intent would find their own eyes turned to stone. Some scholars look beyond Greek texts to archaeological and anthropological possibilities, suggesting that the figure of the Gorgon might derive from older, pre-Hellenic cults where monstrous female entities guarded thresholds. In this light, Medusa carries echoes not only of individual tragedy but of long-standing motifs about female power and the dangers assigned to it. She becomes a palimpsest of the way societies have treated powerful women, at once feared, venerated, and controlled, sometimes worshipped, sometimes abject. The image of the serpent is central and carries a host of meanings across cultures, from death and danger to rebirth and healing. Snakes shed their skins, and so even as Medusa's hair is a sign of curse, it is also an emblem of continual renewal. That duality allows myths to be reread. Are snakes merely signs of malevolent transformation, or can they be viewed as marks of regenerative power, a bodily vocabulary that refuses a single valence? When you imagine Medusa, you are always balancing fear with fascination, because she is both wound and remedy in mythic terms. To tell the story of Medusa is also to talk about sight, and the myth is obsessed with what it means to look and to be looked at. Direct gaze in the tale is dangerous because it is absolute. The look that petrifies does not allow for the nuance of being seen softly or of being loved. The shield that Perseus uses reflects sight back like a paradox, sight without vulnerability, suggesting that what we can handle is always mediated and that directness is often reserved for what we cannot control. There is a cruelty to the mythology's handling of sight because it turns the act of bearing trauma into a spectacle that others consume for their own advantage. Medusa is punished into visibility, and then her visible part is appropriated, displayed, and recycled into power. That sequence produces a sadness that sits not only in the stories but in the fabric of how those stories have been used, victims made into instruments of glory, pain turned into trophies. Another layer is the relationship between Medusa and Athena, which scholars and listeners have struggled to parse. Athena is a goddess of wisdom and war, a protector of cities, and the manner of her vengeance is oddly bureaucratic. She punishes the site, the temple, by making Medusa an eternal sign. Did Athena act out of wounded pride or a desire to preserve the sanctity of the sacred order? Different tellings swing the motive toward wrath, toward legalism, or toward a protective if misdirected response, and each reveals the storyteller's sense of divine justice. Religion in antiquity did not always present gods as morally impeccable beings. Their actions were human-sized in their pettiness as well as their grandeur. The gods' quarrels are often staged on human bodies because the mythic world is not distant but intimate, and mortals are the terrain upon which immortal passions play out. Medusa stands at the intersection of divine caprice and mortal fate, a place where ethics are negotiated through beauty and terror rather than through any system we would now call fair. There are also regional variations in how the story is told that shed light on local priorities. In some locales, Medusa is more associated with chthonic forces, the subterranean deities of earth and death, while in others she is made into a more urban symbol of protection for civic spaces. When a city used her face on its public walls, it declared itself under the guard of a force that could stop enemies in their tracks, and when a temple carved her into a pediment, they announced that the sacred space harbored terrifying, necessary power. The conception of Medusa in art moves through styles as well, from the stiff, archaic Gorgonian of the early Greek world with its frontal stare and bulging eyes, to the more naturalistic, sometimes even eroticized images of later centuries. Artists have sometimes softened her ferocity into melancholy, sometimes exaggerated it into grotesque caricature, and sometimes deliberately used beauty and horror together to make a point. Each era's image tells us as much about that era as it does about Medusa's myth, what people feared, what they needed to hide, and what they wanted to display. Because her tale touches so many chords, Medusa has been a useful figure for poets and playwrights who want to explore the mechanics of shame and shame's public consequences. The podium of tragedy loves a figure who embodies suffering, and dramatists across time have used her to ask how communities assign blame and how memory is shaped by spectacle. The story gives playwrights a ready-made parable about law, honor, and the gendered division of culpability. There are moments even in the ancient texts when Medusa's own voice seems to surface, though rarely as more than an echo. Later writers sometimes imagine her speaking after the beheading, or else they insert laments into her prelude, giving her lying where the old epics left a silence. Those insertions matter because myth often silences the defeated, and giving Medusa language is a way to rehumanize the figure that tradition has made monstrous. The motif of metamorphosis in Medusa's story resonates with a larger Greek preoccupation with changing shapes and altered bodies, where gods and mortals often trade flesh and form. Ovid, who loves transformation, treats Medusa in a way that makes the metamorphosis personal and pointed, while other poets use her change to speak about law and order. To be transformed into stone is to be objectified at the most absolute level, immobile, ornamental, useful, and the metaphor for social objectification is hard to miss. It is telling that the instrument of the petrifying gaze, the head, is taken and displayed, as if the world needs a relic of terror to keep memory productive. In myths and in art, Medusa's head becomes a stubborn icon that is at once a weapon and a keepsake, an aesthetic artifact and a moral warning. The ambivalence we feel looking at that head on an old shield is the same ambivalence the ancients felt when they asked whether terror could ever be the foundation of order. Even the children who spring from the stroke of Perseus connect to broader mythic economies. Pegasus flies off to symbolically link earth and sky, a creature that belongs to heroic epics, while Chrysaor, often less elaborated, stands as a martial or golden counterpart. That life emerging from death is almost a metaphysical joke. The violent severing of life yields creatures that are neither fully monstrous nor fully human, but mythic hybrids who go on to populate other stories. Life and death thus are braided in ancient imagination, so that one cruel act is not merely an end but a source of further narratives. The persistence of Medusa's story in European art from antiquity through the Renaissance and into modernity is a testament to its productive ambiguity. Painters, sculptors, and writers have used her to discuss the look and the looked at, to stage revenge, and to probe the ethics of divine and human violence. Caravaggio painted her severed head with such visceral immediacy that the viewer is forced into complicity, while later Romantic and modern artists recast her in terms of feminine rage or sublime terror. Modern theory has also claimed Medusa, from psychoanalysis to feminism, each discipline reading the myth as if it were a trove of symbols. Freud and his followers sometimes treated the narrative as a kind of dream map, a tale about castration anxiety or maternal fear, while later feminist theorists argued that the myth encodes cultural mechanisms of female suppression. Neither account is exhaustive, but both attest to the depth of the image and the way it flexes to bear complex psychological and social meanings. Archaeologists continue to find Gorgonea carved into stone, and each discovery peels back a layer of how people used the image practically and ritually. In ancient homes, a Gorgonean might be placed above a door to scare away thieves and ghosts, and on ships it might ward off dangers of the sea. The ubiquity of that face in everyday objects suggests that people relied on mythic power routinely, that magic and superstition were woven into commerce and domestic life rather than confined to dramatic ritual. Medusa's story also invites us to think about the limits of mercy and the role of public censure. Athena's harsh measure can be read as a kind of ritual enforcement. Sacred spaces must be defended, and when they are violated, an example must be made. Yet the example she makes is cruel and misdirected, and it sets up a pattern where victims are burdened with visible signs of crime rather than being acknowledged in their full human suffering. That dynamic has a long afterlife in societal responses to sexual violence, where blame and stigma often attach themselves to those harmed rather than to those who harmed them. It is worth pausing on the image of petrification itself, because the metaphor is both literal and imaginative. To be turned to stone is to lose mobility, to be rendered incapable of speech, action, or renewal, and yet stone can be sculpted, moved, and reinterpreted. Medusa's petrification, then, paradoxically freezes her while making her a permanent part of the cultural landscape, an object that can be readdressed and reshaped by storytellers and artists across centuries. When we imagine ancient listeners hearing these tales around hearths or in city squares, we can sense how Medusa's story functions as a communal pedagogy. It warns, it explains, it fascinates, and it unsettles. The tale teaches about sacred spaces and their sanctity, about the caprice of the gods, and about the hazards of beauty and desire in a world where order is fragile. But it also teaches something darker, that justice can be a matter of spectacle, and that narratives can be used to manage social discomfort by converting it into sensational moral drama. The fecundity of Medusa's image also stems from its emotional intensity. The story packs sorrow, outrage, and wonder into compact scenes. The temple's marble floor, Poseidon's force like a tide, Athena's glove of retribution, a maiden's transformation into a figure of fear, these are cinematic moments that demand art and thought. Because the tale is so dense with emotion, every retelling finds a different scene to mine, and the myth lives on by changing its emphasis as the world that tells it changes. Even as we interrogate the unfairness of the gods' verdict, there is a strange dignity in Medusa's endurance. She bears the curse and the exile, lives out her days on the margins, and becomes an icon whose face will not easily be forgotten. There is agency in the way she is later used as a protective emblem, a reclaiming of the weapon made against her as an armor for the many, a paradoxical victory when what once punished is turned into a safeguard. The story's endurance also teaches us about the human appetite for cautionary tales. Myths like this give shape to anxieties about transgression and about the boundaries between the sacred and the profane. They grant rituals power by providing stories that explain why certain rules are necessary and why certain images must be shown to deter harm. But they also reveal the ways cultural fear can be encoded in punitive measures that fall unfairly on the vulnerable, and that lesson remains urgent. As centuries passed, artists and writers repeatedly returned to Medusa, each era recasting her to fit contemporary concerns. Renaissance artists staged her as a lesson in virtue and vice, romantic poets read her as an emblem of sublime terror, modernists used her to explore alienation, and feminists reclaimed her as a figure of righteous resistance. Across these transformations, she defies being pinned down. She is ancient and modern, monstrous and sympathetic, a terror and a talisman all at once. The story of Medusa also ripples into the natural world, where snakes and stone are charged with symbolic meaning. The hiss of a serpent is both a real sound and a literary trope. Snakeskin is both an object of fear and a natural example of renewal. Medusa inhabits that liminal space between animal instinct and human personhood, and her hybrid nature makes her a perfect vessel for stories that pit reason against the wild, law against desire. In literature and music, the motif of the head continues to captivate because it is a concentrated site of identity. Remove the head and you remove face, voice, agency, and speech. Perseus' triumph is thus a monstrous triumph over personhood masquerading as heroism, and the violence of the beheading speaks to how cultures often valorize conquest without considering what is sacrificed. When artists show the moment of decapitation, the image forces contemplation of the ethics of victory, of whether triumph built on mute bodies can ever be clean. Yet even in death, Medusa's power persists, which is perhaps the most unsettling part of the myth. Her head continues to petrify, to be used, to hang on a hero's belt as a guarantee of safety. The persistence of her potency after death suggests that violence does not erase influence, that trauma has afterlives that can be channeled for good or ill, and that the instruments of power are often forged from the memories of pain. The tale also connects to ritual practices where the boundary between fear and protection is deliberately blurred. To place a terrifying image at a home or temple is to acknowledge that protection sometimes requires acknowledging dangers in a visible form. This logic has the uncomfortable consequence of valorizing terror as necessary for survival, and it invites reflection on how societies choose which images to keep and which to discard. Modern reinterpretations often restore Medusa's voice in ways that ancient stories denied her, and when that happens, the narrative feels different, less like a cautionary tale and more like a testimony. Writers who let Medusa speak turn the petrifying gaze into a metaphor for the consequences of silencing victims, and they transform the token of punishment into a demand for justice. Such reinventions are part of a larger cultural project of reevaluating myths through ethical lenses that didn't exist when the stories were first told. Thinking about Medusa also forces us to wrestle with the function of myth. Is it to teach, to warn, to entertain, to manage social anxieties, or some combination of all these? The story resists a single answer because it embodies multiple uses at once. It is entertainment, morality play, and cultural artifact. Its ability to be read in so many ways is not a weakness but a sign of richness, and it explains why listeners across epochs have kept returning to the image of the Gorgon. There is also a spatial aspect to the story. Medusa's exile to the outskirts, to islands or barren shores, reflects how societies push dangerous knowledge to their peripheries. Those liminal spaces are where monsters dwell and where the world tests its boundaries, places where what is unregulated meets what is ordered. The geography of exile in the myth underscores how social order is maintained by defining and isolating threats, and how that practice often leaves the marginalized beyond the circle of empathy. The religious aspect of the tale is not merely theological but constitutional. Myths codify values and give them narrative form. By scripting scenes of transgression and punishment, religions and cultures teach citizens how to think about harm and sanctity. Medusa's story reads in that register as an origin tale for certain taboos and anxieties, a way to remind communities that some acts dissociate the sacred and demand redress, even if the redress is misapplied. Ultimately, the birth of Medusa and her cursing by the gods is as much a story about creation as it is about destruction. From an act of violence come transformations, offspring, and images that will guard the avenues of cities for generations. The complexity of that creation, how it intertwines power, beauty, shame, and protection, makes the myth a perennial subject for artists and thinkers seeking to understand how societies and individuals respond to trauma. If you listen carefully to the myth's many retellings, you will hear a chorus of questions. Who deserves punishment when gods quarrel? What happens to those who are marked by violence? Can fear be useful, and who profits when terror is institutionalized? These are not questions with easy answers, but their persistence in the Medusa tale is a reason the story continues to be told, studied, and rewritten. Across its long life, the Medusa myth has been both a mirror and a malleable shard of rock in the hands of artists, theologians, and social critics. It has been used to awe, to instruct, to terrify, to shield, and to liberate, depending on the needs and fears of the age. The figure of Medusa thus becomes less a single creature than a constellation of meanings that each generation rearranges. Finally, the story is a reminder that human narratives are instruments as much as artifacts. They shape how we look at each other, whom we fear, whom we protect, and whom we punish. Medusa's birth as a cursed figure by the gods forces us to reckon with the ways power operates, arbitrarily, often cruelly, and with consequences that ripple outward for centuries. To tell her story is to participate in that ripple, to choose which aspects to amplify, which to soften, and which to condemn, and in doing so we keep alive the dialogue between the past's monstrous images and the present's moral sensibilities. They slept for a long time, not the deep sleep of the dead but a patient, gathering kind of sleep, like winter waiting behind a glass. The island around them had grown brittle with reason and rumor, a place where sailors told one another stories with the lantern between them and then refused to speak the name. When the earth shifted and the sea forgot its measured rhythm, the sisters woke, slow as tidewater and bright as a struck stone, and the world that had made them a myth tilted to listen. When Medusa opened her eyes, the first light knew to be careful, tracing the ridges of her face without daring to fix upon the pupils that were said to hold the sky. Her sisters watched from the shadowed curve of the cavern, their breathing a whisper of scales and salt, and the echoes returned their names with a patience that had no hurry. In that hour, the place between myth and life thinned like a worn veil, and every small, treacherous truth began to breathe again. They were called Gorgons and hot-mouthed tongues, a name that tasted like stone and iron, but their memory was older than the words that bound them. Once they had been daughters of the earth, children of lineages whose stakes were measured in rivers and seasons rather than in shrines. Stories had angled toward them like flint. Those stories found them and reshaped them into the angles that frightened men, yet left out the soft, human parts that flinched and loved and hurt. Steno, fierce of jaw and immortal by a stubborn ancient math, leaned against the cavern wall with the careful indifference of a creature who had outlived explanation. Euryale, whose voice could still shake the lanterns in a town a day's walk away if she chose, held to a small, impossible sorrow that did not soften despite centuries. And Medusa, the youngest, carried the fragile history of mortality under her skin, a rumor of a girl whose life had been rewoven into scales and dread. They remembered rain that tasted like copper in gardens that were once theirs to harvest, but memory arrived in pieces, like coins scattered along a tide mark. Each sister held different fragments, a name, a laugh, a hand pressed too fiercely to a shoulder. Those pieces did not fit together kindly, and so they made songs of what was lost to keep the threads unbroken, singing until silence could no longer pretend to be unimportant. Outside the cave, sailors found their compasses confounded and their lines maddened, their fish become ghostly mirrors where nothing moved. The island's cliffs began to wear faces carved by wind, and fishermen who came in the dawn claimed to glimpse three figures on the rocks, statues still as vows. But the men were careful. Fishermen tell stories to guard themselves from the wild, and when a story becomes a protection, it collects detail like barnacles. Medusa walked where the light could wash her without asking for permission, and the shells at her feet shimmered as though they held tiny suns. Snakes were her hair, and not simply decorations. They were companions who hissed confidences and tasted the tide and the thoughts of passing birds. Their tongues set a rhythm against her neck, and sometimes she smiled because of a joke a snake's forked tongue understood before language had a word for it. In the beginning of the telling, gods were nearer, close enough to pluck feelings off like fruit and taste them as they pleased. Athena, who had been one of them in a time loosened by grief and argument, had turned a choice into a sentence that would echo like thunder. The story is told differently in the mouths of priests and poets, and each version carries its own small cruelty. For some, Medusa was a lover-turned-monster for her infidelity; for others, a maiden sacrificed as collateral for a god's temper. But what happened in truth slips through the nets of those versions. Truth is a stone in a river that rolls and is reshaped by current. Medusa remembered a temple floor cool against bare feet, the salt of someone else's hand in her hair, and the sudden, impossible betrayal of a world that decided her body could be a battleground. That moment was the hinge. It cracked open the story and let the sisters' names tumble into new shapes. Steno and Euryale had watched and not understood, because gods can be jealous and cruel and people can be terrified of the things they cannot master. They had leapt into indignation as if it were a clean sword, and their anger was a thing that did not yield to pity. Fury is a companion that sometimes protects and sometimes consumes, and for these sisters it became the armor that would also become the prison. Medusa's transformation was a terrible artistry. Her skin gained a sheen like polished marble, cool and implacable, and her hair became a tangle of snakes that reacted to the merest thought. Yet beneath the scales, the human tremble remained, the small dissatisfactions of muscle, the memory of cold toes, the echo of a laugh from a childhood that had been simpler and crueler in its own ways. They were given a name that made travelers quicken their steps, but names do not make fate, they only describe it. The Gorgons took the shapes that fear required of them, and so people carved them on shields to ward off danger, as if the likeness of a terror could repel the terror itself. Truth, however, is not something you can hold at bay by repetition. The sisters were more than the images hammered into bronze or painted on temple walls. They learned the economy of solitude, how to measure hunger and resentment by little rituals, how to count the days by the change of sea and sky. So much of living as a legend is about learning to be invisible until visibility is weaponized against you. Their cave became both sanctuary and prison, a place where echoes could be trusted to return a word unspoiled and where silence could be trained to cushion the blow of a new insult. On the days when the sisters ventured beyond the rock, they moved like weather, unpredictable and slow, with long intervals of motion and stillness. Merchants who saw them sometimes told false stories that made the community safe to itself, and scholars wrote long treatises trying to turn living myth into dictionaries. But myth untamed resists being pinned down. It shifts like mercury within explanations and insists on its own interior logic. Medusa's gaze was a rumor with teeth. People had said it turned men to stone and that their faces froze as if photographed by fate, but the reality was more complicated and cleaner and more human. To look at Medusa was to confront an unbearable truth about one's own inner architecture, a revelation so sharp that it calcified pride and pretension into a final, stubborn posture. There were those who sought her for the certainty of an end. Men who counted bravery as a ledger entry sailed to the island in boats lacquered with hubris. The best known of them is woven into countless retellings, a young man with the kind of bravery that did not always recognize its shape, moss on the knees of his armor, a gift of cunning by Hermes and a shield by Athena. Perseus named himself in the long line of heroes and left footprints that would be retold for centuries, but the tale of that night is not simple and not wholly owned by him. If this part of the story made you feel the clash between courage and pride, subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you connect more with Perseus chasing glory or with Medusa facing her fate. Perseus's approach was a geometry of light and trick. He used a shield as a mirror to avoid meeting Medusa's eyes directly, and he struck with the careful precision of someone who thinks cleaving a head will answer a question as old as fear. The head he took from Medusa would not, in truth, end her story, because a story does not end at the chopping block. Decapitation is a dramatic punctuation, not a conclusion, and narratives like the Gorgons weave beyond the gestures people make to be remembered. When the head of Medusa was severed, something like a rupture opened that let other things slip through. Pegasus sprang from wet iron and blood, a horse with wings, born of a violence that did not ask permission to create. Chrysaor, who carried a golden sword, came into being as well. Children of a wound, they were proofs that pain can blossom into other complexities, neither wholly good nor evil. But the sisters remained, and their grief was not simple. They had been rendered myth and then had myth abstracted into hagiography and cautionary tales, and through all the retellings their bodies remembered what stories cannot do: the weight of a hand, the sound of a laugh, the precise way wind liked to press against stone. Steno's anger turned inward to become a litany of defiance that cost her none of her immortality, and Euryalus' cries shook the cliffs until new caves were formed, as if the land itself was marking grief with architecture. Isolation found ways to teach that no one had expected to learn. They learned to share silence as if it were a meal, passing it between them and savoring what it meant to be two or three beings in the same world that called them one thing. They developed a vocabulary of looks, a shading of a glance, a twist of a lip, that said more than any human tongue could, and those subtleties became entire novels of meaning beneath the loose skin of their everyday gestures. There were times when tourists, if one can call them that in a mythic landscape, would come with candles and petitions, asking for blessings that were actually demands dressed in soft paper. People asked for fertility, for protection, for guidance, and sometimes for curses intended for another, because faith can be a blunt instrument. The sisters answered the ones they felt inclined to answer and taught that mercy is not a currency to be spent without thought. The island itself responded to their presence as well. Places listened when something ancient woke and began to speak again. Plants near their cave grew with odd geometries, vines curling away as if to avoid gaze, moss clear and glassy like petrified breath. Sea birds sometimes refused to come within reach. Their flight patterns rewrote themselves like pen strokes rearranging a map. Stories of the Gorgons entered into the echoes of human emotion and became metaphors that humans used to talk about shame and power and the cost of being other. Mothers used the tale to scare children into obedience, poets used it as a metaphor for horror and protection, and artists painted faces with too many teeth and eyes too bright. Each retelling carved into the Gorgons' reputations new facets, and yet no portrait could hold the sisters entirely. They moved in the spaces between brushstrokes. Over centuries, civilizations rose like tides and then fell back to sand, and the sisters watched capitals build up their monuments then crumble into stories told in the aftermath. Empires left offerings at the caves, crude trinkets and carved idols placed with the ambiguous benevolence of those who worshiped not to honor but to secure. Some relics were honest, made by hands who sought to say thank you, Others were manipulative, attempts to turn the sisters' power into a totem no longer living. Medusa's name became a kind of shorthand for many things at once: danger, protection, otherness, and deep wrong. The child's shudder at a bedtime tale and the hardened general's brand on a shield were both echoes from the same mythic stone. Yet none of these uses answered the human question that tugged at the cave's edge. What did the sisters themselves want, if anything, beyond being left to the kinds of quiet that might include music and bread? If there was a desire that threaded through them, it was not for vengeance alone, it was for recognition that did not seek to reshape them into fable. They wanted the world to see them with all their contradictions, monstrous and vulnerable, wise and sorrowful, alive in the raw ways no museum can lock away. For Medusa, especially, there was a wish as fragile as a moth's wing, to be remembered not only for the power of her gaze but for the human story that was clipped from her when language needed an enemy. They practiced craft so that honing a skill would translate time into something shaped rather than simply endured. With their hands and their reptilian patience, they carved small objects from discarded shells and the remains of ships, turning debris into vessels that could hold rain or silence or a story suspended like a bead. Crafting reminded them that creation can be quiet and that the world offers materials for making that do not require permission from the gods. And because myths are not only about solitude, they encountered other beings who, like them, lived on the margins, creatures who had names that forgot themselves in the tide, witches with histories wrapped in roots, old sailors whose memories hung like seaweed. These meetings were complex. Sometimes they were tender, sometimes brittle, and sometimes they were transactions masquerading as friendships. Such relationships taught the sisters the soft skill of being in the world without insisting the world be different than it was. In time, the island altered too, slowly picking up the stories and wearing them like a second skin. Villages that had once skirted the rock with whispered names began to build small shrines, not to banish the Gorgons but to coexist with them. People left gifts that were honest instead of fearful: a bowl with fresh water, a song on certain nights, the simple kindness of a distant, careful presence. These offerings did not fix their reputations, but they softened night edges. Children would bring flowers and run away because the curiosity anchored in them more strongly than the caution taught by their elders. The sisters, who had learned the arithmetic of danger, sometimes accepted these small tokens and sometimes let them drift back into the tide, as if they wanted only the proof that someone had seen and chosen to respond without spectacle. It is dangerous to think of myth as only ancient business. Myth moves and rearranges itself like tides and language and politics. New poets took Medusa and made her the emblem for women who had been wronged, for people turned into monsters by other people's shaping. The figure of Medusa entered into protest banners and novels and the quiet spaces of academic rooms, where arguments about gaze and agency bloom and retract in complicated ways. Such reclaimings worked some magic. They returned a part of story ownership to those who had been its subject rather than its spectacle. Yet reclaimed images are not stitches that reattach the past, they are reinterpretations that stand on their own. Observers who placed Medusa on the banners of the modern world asked different questions and demanded different answers, and that act of questioning itself changed the energy that circled the island. The sisters watched these ripples with a mixture of curiosity and fatigue, because change takes new forms of pressure along with relief. To be transmuted into an emblem of resistance is both a balm and a fresh kind of exposure, which can be exhausting as a lighthouse keeping constant vigilance. Sometimes the sisters wanted simply to be private and ordinary, as much as anyone shaded by myth can seek the ordinary. Time braided its fingers through their existences, and the meaning of their names shifted through tongues and generations. Medusa's image became printed on everything from protective amulets to fashion plates, and the commercial world loved the clean, shocking economy of a face that could freeze a thing in place. There is an odd irony in being both a warning and a commodity, in being sold as a talisman that promises safety from the very terror it embodies. The island itself became less of a location and more of a metaphor in human imagination, a place where people could project their fears and yearnings. Pilgrims of different sorts arrived for different reasons, some for an academic curiosity, others for a sensation that verged on worship. The sisters greeted these advancements with the cautious hospitality of seasoned hosts, offering what could be offered without giving up their core autonomy. Over time, scholars came in boats with notebooks and warm coats, attempting to study rather than to conquer, and some of them listened in ways that were surprising and useful. They recorded versions that were not interested solely in who slew whom and why, but instead asked what it felt like to be transformed, what it took to keep an interior life when the world insists you be an object. Those records became new kinds of texts, not shrines and not tombs, but maps to the lived experience of mythic beings trying to survive the modern world. The sisters adapted their survival tactics to new realities, social rituals updated, offerings exchanged for stories rather than fear. Medusa would sometimes walk at twilight to the boundary of the human settlements and watch and learn the new languages of machinery and light. She found, to her tempered amazement, that small, modern joys, hot bread, a child's smile, the smell of a place that makes you think of home, still mattered in the calculus of an immortal's day. Still, the name of Perseus hung around their history like a shadow. His triumph had been told and retold, magnified in epic tones, and it had always felt like a wound that was presented as proof of a masculine valor. The sisters knew that some stories never die, they only swell and shift, and the story of Medusa's head traveled to great courts and then into the smallest, strangest pockets of human conversation. After centuries, new artists and writers and filmmakers took up the image of Medusa and forbade her to be diminished to a single act she had endured. They painted her in hues that made her both beautiful and terrible, tender and exacting. Each medium reshaped the look and the tone of the sisters' myth. A film's close-up allowed for a nuance that a terracotta vase could not hold. A poem could bend the reader's sympathy in a way a lawmaker's edict never could. Those reinterpretations sometimes helped people outside the island feel less alone with their own painful stories, and that was a kind of redemption the sisters grudgingly appreciated. To be used as a symbol for healing turned the sharp edges of history into a softer thing that could cradle others. Yet symbols can also be misused and flattened, and the sisters knew the cost of becoming useful in ways that remove the messy interiority that makes anyone truly human. There was a season when the island saw visitors who came with modern intentions, scientists, activists, poets, who wanted to hear and to tell stories honestly. They recorded the sisters' narratives not as curiosities but as testimonies. Those accounts spread and multiplied, forming a new dialect of understanding where empathy and myth braided into an unusual alliance. Sometimes a child would slip through the crowd and go alone to the cave, offering a toy without a need to be seen as brave or clever. Children have an instinct for the ungainly truth of things, and their smallness can be disarming in the best way. A child would sit cross-legged before Medusa and braid a snake's thin length with a blind, careful hand, and the room would fill with an almost domestic kind of holiness. In the long arc of human time, pride often mislabels actions as heroism where they are merely negligence. The Gorgon's existence became an argument about how cultures decide which bodies are sanctified and which are vilified. This debate took many forms: legal, poetic, political, and it was messy and persistent, which made it, in a sense, worth the labor of attention. Steno's immortal teeth and Euryalus' indomitable lungs became instruments of a history that refused to be tidied neatly. They thrived in a way that was not always graceful. Survival has its clumsy edges. They grew adept at shaping the small rituals that make life bearable, preparing food, arranging smooth stones into a line, humming an old song that reminded them of before and after at once. Medusa learned to love little things with the fierceness of the injured who know joy is a risky but necessary thing to hold. She kept a small bowl that the sea had polished until it was translucent, and sometimes she would lay small trinkets inside, objects given by those who had washed ashore and felt guilty or grateful or both. These bowls represented a capacity for care that exists despite and because of the monstrous labels set upon her. On a fog-heavy morning, a young woman came alone to the cave, not to slay and not to worship but to ask for a place to grieve. She had lost something that had been more than a thing, and she needed someone who could absorb sorrow without being shocked by it. The sisters received her in a way that surprised them all, circling her grief like midwives around a birth, helping it be born into the world where it could be named and held. Stories like these are the kind that do not usually make it into the clean pages of textbooks. They are small and stubborn and live in the margins. But it is these ordinary, unheroic acts that accumulate into the true measure of beings like the Gorgons. Their lives were not a single moment of violence or a heroic slaying, and when the world sees only a single flash it misses the slow luminosity beneath it. They watched seasons roll with the patience of stones and the thoughtfulness of things that have learned to listen. In winter the sea receded and the cave closed its teeth against the wind, and in summer the island filled with a chorus of insects and the shrieks of gulls. Through it all, the sisters' conversations wound and unwound like threads in a loom, knitting their shared history into the fabric of a life that refuses to be simple. When modern explorers attempted to categorize them, they found their categories inadequate, which is often the case when living things are put into the neat boxes of human taxonomy. The sisters were creatures of contradiction, less a scientific specimen than a necessary complication in the world. To understand them was to accept that some things are resistant to being wholly known and that part of the world's richness is held in such resistance. Time continued its slow, unstoppable commerce, bringing with it inventions that sang with strange music, electricity, radio, a world shrunk by communication. News arrived in ways that once would have astonished them, and those new patterns of sound and light folded into the sisters' days like another tide. With modernization came new forms of attention and new dangers, but it also brought allies who had previously had no voice in the conversation about myth and ownership. They collaborated with those allies in cautious ways, teaching what could be taught and withholding what must remain private. Medusa's lessons were not militant or preachy. She taught by example how to own one's history without letting it be the only thing that determines one's entire life. She taught that being a symbol is sometimes useful and sometimes suffocating, and that a person, or a being, can be both a symbol and something fiercely, magnificently more. At night, when the world lay like a closed book and the moon cut its pale pages over the water, the sisters would tell one another the small stories of who they had been before the world required monsters. They told tales of childhood pranks and skinned knees and a lover's foolish compliment, and in the telling they softened and became human again in the only way that they could, through memory and witness. Those reminiscences were the tenderest magic they possessed, an alchemy that turned loss into something that could be carried rather than crushed. They never stopped being dangerous to those who sought to use them as shorthand for a single truth, because danger, in their case, was a refusal to be simplified. Their very existence questioned easy narratives about victimhood and villainy and pushed those who met them into the difficult work of seeing complexity. That is the heavy kindness of myth. It forces us to reckon with larger truths in the only ways we have, by telling stories that refuse to be polite. At times tragedy returned like a tidal weather, bringing with it strangers who arrived with different agendas and used new tools to test old boundaries. Technology bridged continents, and with it came people who wanted to prove myths were errors or to make their remnants into trophies. Each new onslaught was a test of the sisters' capacity to hold firm and the world's capacity to learn humility. Yet the sisters were not only reactive, they invented new rituals that patrolled the border between the island and the human world, ceremonies that acknowledged the deep interdependence between beings and the land. They taught the villagers small practices of reverence that asked for nothing more than attention and reciprocity, and those practices spread slowly like a gentle law. In that spreading there was a quiet revolution. It is harder to demonize someone whose life you touch in simple, sustained ways. Artists came again and again with new languages, canvas, film, words, sound, and each time the sisters considered how much of themselves to reveal. They had discovered that image is powerful and image is dangerous, and so they curated themselves with a wary tenderness. They allowed some portraits that felt honest and refused others that felt like exploitation, maintaining an integrity that surprised those who expected myth to be a public resource. They read, in the faces of some observers, genuine understanding, eyes widening in recognition, heads inclined as if listening to a confession. Those moments were small but luminous, and they multiplied a sense that the sisters' story had moved from a single sliver of terror into a broader human conversation. And in that conversation the idea of Medusa shifted like light through a prism, refracting into many colors of meaning. There was a new danger: commercialism. The world that could commodify a legend could also trivialize pain. Merchandise, slogans, ephemeral fashion borrowed the shock of Medusa's visage without accounting for the history of suffering that shaped it. The sisters found themselves fielding attention that felt shallow and abrasive, and they developed a new skepticism born of repeated disappointments. They cultivated their own myths in response, small and personal stories that countered the ones printed in glossy pages. Medusa told stories of the time she once sat with a woman who had been taught to fear her and who left holding a handful of pebbles, thinking them sacred. Those pebbles, the woman said, were hope, and that was a notion Medusa had not expected to hold so tenderly. In community, the sisters made choices that balanced their own needs with the fragile ecosystem surrounding them. They negotiated with fishermen, spoke with local healers, and sometimes, when they were feeling expansive, they invited a few trusted visitors to the cave to listen and learn. Trust, carefully extended and cherished, began to stitch a small patch of the world into a tapestry that recognized the value of being seen whole. Even the gods, whose relationships to mortals and monsters are perennial and complex, changed their tune incrementally over centuries. Some retreated into old stories and brimstone logic, while others found new ways of honoring those who had been hurt by divine casualness. The sisters' relationship with divinity became, in some respects, a ledger of demands and small satisfactions, a continuing negotiation between the eternal and the human. As cultures debated the meaning of gaze and violence and the ethics of looking, academic conversation and public sentiment seeped into legal realms and then into a broader social understanding. Discussions about consent and representation and the weaponization of the body took up space in which Medusa's image was now relevant. Her story, stripped of attempts to make it tidy, provided a rich template for thinking about responsibility and harm. Through it all, the Gorgons retained the threads of humor that had kept them alive in darker times. Steno's laugh could shatter a jar if she allowed it to bloom, and Euryale's sarcasm was a kind of weather that could lift spirits like wind lifts a kite. Humor is not an escape for them but a method for living. It is a salve and a tool, sharpening perspective while softening the heart's edges. As the era of humans busied itself with screens and signals, the sisters learned to be patient with the speed and the sloppiness of people who are always rushing to be seen. They observed a world addicted to narratives that travel fast and simplify, and they used that observation to their advantage by crafting stories that were slow and allowed for complexity. Some of those slow stories found their way into classrooms and living rooms, and they became seeds of a different kind of cultural memory. At their core, the sisters never forgot the people who had loved them before the world had chosen to fear them, nor did they entirely forgive those who had harmed them. Memory is not kind or cruel, memory just is, and it carried both gratitude and resentment in roughly equal measures. That mixture made them wise in ways that polite philosophy cannot teach. When Medusa sometimes stood at the cliff edge and watched whales move like mountains under the surface, she thought about the absurd generosity of nature. It makes new life from old bones with an elegant amnesia. Skeletons of the past feed the living in ways that are quiet and relentless. There is comfort in that cycle for a being who has been made myth and then remade by time. The sisters' story became a lens for questions about who has the right to tell other people's stories. As more voices clamored for the microphone, debates about representation and narrative ownership grew sharp and sometimes violent. These arguments were fertile ground for change because they demanded accountability, and accountability shaped new social contracts around how myth and history intersect. They trained apprentices of a sort, people who came with sincere intent and who wanted to learn the old languages of patience and listening. Under the sisters' tutelage, these apprentices learned to be caretakers of stories rather than their exploiters. This was a gentle revolution, knowledge transferred through stories and acts, not through conquest. Sometimes the island gave up remnants of old gods and old wars, scattered relics surfaced after storms, and with them came questions about origins. Archaeologists who worked with humility and curiosity sometimes shed light that was helpful, and those who came with greed added only more noise. The sisters learned to negotiate with the new disciplines, extracting from them the utility of knowledge without allowing themselves to be reduced. At the heart of all their efforts was a stewardship of their own narrative, a careful cultivating of memory and identity. They refused to let their images be used as blunt instruments for other people's agendas without consent. In that refusal, they taught a wider world an important lesson, that history belongs to the people who live it, not merely to those who tell it loudly. When storms came, when history pulsed in waves of violence, or when human chimeras of war and profit looked to exploit sacred sites, the sisters became protectors in literal ways. Their presence repelled those who were careless and demanded recompense from those who tried to take more than they had right to. Protection was not merely an act of aggression, it was a stewardship of place and dignity in equal measure. Years passed into decades that none of them kept in clocks, but time marked them in softer ways, an extra line near the mouth of Steno, a new loss in Euryalus' voice, the way Medusa's smile had gathered new meanings. They survived, not in the sense of merely living, but in the richer sense of continuing to refine what it meant to be alive in a world that would not stop telling them who they were. Survival became an ongoing project of definition and resistance. In quiet hours, the sisters reflected on the paradox that they had become both shields and targets, offerings and warnings. To exist in that paradox required a constant, almost artisan care, the rearrangement of one's interior life into a form that could be carried and shared. This was a work without end, and perhaps that is part of what makes myths endure. They are practices rather than fixed monuments. At times they entertained the idea of leaving the island, to rejoin the world that had made them and turned away, but the idea was both seductive and dangerous. Movement would require translation into 1,000 small decisions and compromises, and they had learned that adaptation could mean loss. They measured each possibility carefully and in their deliberation revealed a discipline forged out of experience rather than theoretical resolve. There is an odd tenderness in the way place roots you even when the world calls you peculiar. The island had become part of them and they part of it. The stone remembered their feet like someone remembers a lover's scent. Leaving would not be an act of liberation so much as an erasure of the map they themselves had come to know intimately. And so they remained, but never static. They shifted their rituals and expanded their vocabulary, allowing new voices into the conversation while protecting the core of what made them a family. Their strength came less from muscle and more from the discipline of living through contradiction with a tenacity that felt almost like compassion applied to self. Compassion for oneself, they discovered, is a radical practice. They met occasional tyrants who thought power could be accumulated like coins, and those encounters were dangerous, swift, and costly. When force was applied unjustly, the sisters held a fierce mirror up to it and called the world to account. They were not sanctified judges but creatures of balance, and sometimes the scales they kept had to be tipped with decisive action to protect the vulnerable. In the years that followed, thinkers began to re-examine the archetypes the Gorgons represented in the human psyche: the fear of the unknown, the punishment of transgression, and the objectification of bodies that did not conform. Scholars mapped the motif across centuries and cultures, showing how some images repeat themselves across time as ways to externalize anxiety. Those examinations were useful not because they simplified the sisters into a psychoanalytic diagram, but because they allowed communities to see the patterns and perhaps avoid repeating harm. Through it all, the sisters cultivated a museum of living memory that refused to be a tomb. They kept an attentive record of their years and small things: painted pebbles, carved shells, songs learned and altered. These artifacts were not meant for spectacle but for preservation, a map that might one day help others navigate the complexities of living as a thing feared and reverent. Medusa in particular learned the practice of translating her gaze into something generous and controlled. She discovered that she could look at a person and not freeze their life into an idea, and that there were ways to engage that taught others to see with dignity rather than terror. That discipline became her quiet pedagogy. There were moments of immense loneliness that not even her sisters could fully enter into, those private crescendos of feeling that time cannot soften entirely. In such moments, Medusa would walk along the shoreline until the cold bit her like honest truth and the waves offered a raw company that was neither judgmental nor sentimental. The sea, in its own indifference, was sometimes the best listener. When storms unmoored the past and old enemies attempted a return, the sisters' old patterns of vigilance reasserted themselves. They called in allies, humans who had learned compassion, creatures who understood the economy of debt, and a few gods who were learning to be less casual about suffering. In that assemblage, the island held, and the world learned again to negotiate the presence of things that do not fit tidy moral spreadsheets. They found joy in small rebellions against the expected story: an evening where they danced with fishermen's children, a night where a poet recited their names with respect and no hint of triumphalism. Joy is rarely a dramatic arc in myths. It is more often a series of small decisions that amount to a life reclaimed. The sisters collected these like shells, and each one shone with its own private luminescence. The younger generations of humans, raised in a world more conscious of narrative injustice, treated them with a mixture of reverence and critical curiosity. Those young people asked questions that were sharper and kinder, and the sisters appreciated the freshness of their minds. In those exchanges, the sisters recognized a future that might one day allow them to exist without being constantly explained away. Time, that steady editor of lives, continued to do its quiet work. The island held its breath through centuries of small negotiations, and the Gorgon stories grew thicker and more complex, taking on the colors of many hands. They were no longer just a cautionary tale told to frighten children. They were custodians of memory, teachers of careful living, and stubborn examples of how beings can hold contradictory truths without falling apart. In the final hours of the day, when the light softened like a confession, the sisters performed a ritual not for any god but for themselves, a washing of old griefs in the cold sea, an exchange of stories so that none of their private histories would be swallowed by the tide. This ritual was neither dramatic nor public, but it was sacred in the only way that sustained beings can make sacred things, by tending them consistently. It was, and remained, an act of fierce and tender survival. The Gorgons awoke and lived and resisted the edges of what others demanded of them, creating in their wake a slow, stubborn revision of what it means to be monster, woman, survivor, and sibling. Their story kept unfolding, not as a single heroic arc but as a continuous practice of being seen and of seeing back with care. In every careful look and in every small kindness, they taught the world to remember that the most dangerous thing is not a gaze but the refusal to look at one another with the full responsibility of being human. Night falls over the sea like a cloth shaken free of stars, and the shape of a single island catches the last crooked light. That island is the place where many stories end and some begin, a spit of rock where wind has learned to memorize loneliness. On that shore the world seems honed down to the sound of water and the small, insistent scratch of wings. Everything else is rumor, and rumor is a dangerous thing to keep close. You will hear the rumor now as if someone has leaned in to whisper it, not because it is a secret but because it is an old wound that remembers how to speak. The wound belongs to a woman and to a hero, and to the space between them where stories are made and remade like glass under fire. We begin with Medusa because her name is a shape that bends light. She is first a daughter of sea and sky, not a monster in the way children learn monsters. In some telling she grows under the laughter of temples and the hush of salt, a mortal girl whose hair is ordinary and whose teeth are like ordinary teeth. It is the world that reshapes her into something else, piece by piece, like a sculptor who will not stop until the clay is no longer clay. The detail matters because the kind of change that makes a woman into a fable is often the accumulation of small betrayals. To speak of Perseus at the same time we speak of Medusa is to fold two sharp destinies into one slow blade. He comes from a different light, raised on the edge of kingdoms and promises, his childhood a ledger of favors and the weight of a father who is both absent and vast. His step into legend begins early with a name whispered by an oracle and a king's vanity that counts his fate. He grows under the influence of expectations, trained to be useful and to be careful with what he carries, his lineage, his temper, and the rumors of what sits beyond the horizon. Each rumor pushes him toward the thing he will have to face. Between island and palace the gods walk as the weather walks, deciding where storms should fall and whose pride should be pricked. Athena appears as wisdom shaped into a woman's armor. Hermes is the fleet-footed mind, carrying mischief and messages in the tips of his sandals. They do not move as capricious children of the sky, they move like architects who know the cost of the buildings they design. The goddess hears the name Medusa and remembers a history of desecration that bends to no comfort, and so she chooses to be involved. The god chooses movement and tools. Their choices will craft an instrument and a path, and instruments and paths are where human hands and immortal wills touch. There is an awkward justice in the gift of a polished shield. Athena hands Perseus a shield that is not a weapon in the blunt sense but a paradox. It is for seeing what should not be looked at directly. The shield's surface holds a reflection like a bowl holds rain. It is not antique glass, but something made for the purpose of turning dangers back into images, safe enough to be observed from a distance. Perseus takes it like a promise and like a warning. He is told to use it as a mirror, to look at Medusa only while keeping his skin and breath separate from her eyes. It is a lesson about sight and about the violence that can occur when sight is unguarded. Hermes hands Perseus a sword that owes its edge to the will of an immortal, a blade tempered by stories. It feels exact in his hand as if the world had been practicing how to fit this handle for him since before he was born. Hermes smiles, which is something like surrender and like instruction, and teaches Perseus the angle of movement not only of feet but also of the mind. He instructs him in timing and in the small deceptive kinds of patience that wars teach, how to wait as if stillness were a ladder. Tools carried by gods carry with them the burden of their gifts. They shape not only the act of killing but the kind of person who will have to live afterward. Medusa is not where the gods first decide she should be. Geography is as changeable in myth as memory. She ends up on an island at the edges of maps because a map is an idea about who is allowed to claim a thing. Her isolation is both protection and punishment. The Gorgons, sisters of stone and storm, keep each other company in ways humanity often confuses. Their laughter is like rocks knocking in a tide, and their anger is a coastal wind that will catalog whoever crosses it. Those sisters are part threat and part refuge, and Medusa's life among them is layered with kinship that the rest of the world misunderstands. Listen to how the world redraws her face when it tastes guilt and vengeance in the same mouth. One late evening she walks into a temple and the place where reverence should have been meets the intrusion of a god. What happens next is described with a language that tries to own what cannot be owned. The narratives fragment and accuse. In some versions she is a willing attendant, in some she is a woman betrayed, and in others she becomes both victim and vanquished, a victim whose fall makes a throne for cruelty. The important fact is the turn from sacred to shame, and how that turn is used as proof that transformation was deserved. The world wants clean cycles. It wants culpability to be a tidy hairline fracture instead of a complicated map. This is where punishment moves like a slow architecture. Athena places upon Medusa a doom and a crown at once, for when a woman is wronged, the ancient world has a way of making her into a lesson. Her hair becomes living serpents because the tail needs a spectacle to justify the coldness later applied to her. The flesh of the story hardens into scales and fangs because the myth must have a monstrous headline. Yet in quieter versions, the snakes are only a symptom and not the disease. They curl where rage and grief live, claws for wounds that could not be asked to heal. Medusa becomes both icon and indictment, and people come to believe the simplest version because simple stories are easier to trade at market. Perseus travels with a kind of loneliness bred in the liminal spaces of prophecy. He is not a brute. He is someone shaped by favor and instrument who must make a moral choice under conditions that matter much less than the sound of the choice being made. The hunt becomes as much a mental map as a physical one. He follows directions from the gods and warnings from mortals, and he collects gear that feels like a borrowed fate. On his chest is the expectation that he will return with a trophy, and the trophy will answer a question the king has not yet thought to ask. What does it mean to kill a thing to save a name? The search for the Gorgons is mapped by an older kind of compass, rumor, fear, and the kind of quiet counsel that happens in taverns. Perseus hears of nymphs who hold keys to ancient doors and of old women who spin prophecies into smoke. These are scenes of small exchange. They are where plans are not made in decrees but in the sharing of bread. It is there he learns to seek the Hesperides or the Grii, the sisters who share an eye and a tooth and who trade them like children trade secrets. The Grii themselves are a study in necessary cruelty. They are guards of knowledge and also its slow executioners, because to know is to be asked to suffer the weight of directions. He takes their eye from them in a kind of surgical theft. Perseus does not strike these old women down. He removes their means of seeing because to steal sight is to stake a claim on the path ahead. He bargains with them, threatening and pleading in equal measure, and the eye passes through his fingers like a hot kernel. That theft is not just a convenience but a story about power, how looking is regulated by those who hold what you need to see. It is a moral complication that sits at the center of the hunt, and it foreshadows the greater questions he will have to answer once his prey is more than a rumor. Each step toward the Gorgons is measured by light and by the weight of the mirror. Perseus moves with the shield at his side, polishing it with a cloth as one might polish a soul before confession. He is careful because the art of reflections is the art of distance. You may look at fear to understand it, but only through a surface that keeps the thing you look at from touching you. The shield makes the hunt bathable in thought. It separates violence from eyes in a way that feels almost merciful. Yet mercifulness can be a brittle currency when a life is at stake. Arriving at the Gorgon's lair is less a spectacle than a series of small noises, a throat-clearing of waves, the slow unwinding of a snake, the hush that follows a story's pause. The place itself does not glimmer with the expected malevolence. It is ordinary in some ways, with rocks to sit on and a smell of salt and old moss. Myth often wants a throne room for villains, but monsters live in the margins because that is where the world can pretend not to notice them. Perseus moves through this ordinary landscape with the extraordinary caution of a man who knows the stakes of each step. He sees Medusa first in reflection and not in flesh because the mirror is both instrument and mercy. In the shield her face arrives as if newly remembered. It is not a picture that stuns immediately but one that makes the air rearrange itself. Her features in the polished silver are smooth with a strange dignity, and her hair is a slow cascade of serpents that do not hiss so much as listen. There is a quality of sadness in the reflected image that a direct view would not allow him to see, a tenderness that the world has tried to clip away. That tenderness is dangerous because pity complicates duty. The moment he strikes is not a single triumphant instant but a sequence of small precisions. He moves with a rhythm taught by Hermes, and the blade, guided by a mind now less driven by rumor than by close observation, finds its mark. The act is clinical, not rapturous. It is a cutting that severs not only brain from bone but also a chain of stories that has held a woman in place as an object lesson. The blade's job is absolute and unpoetic, and afterward there is the peculiar silence of things that have been done because they had to be, not because they were wanted. When blood appears in the tale, it becomes a strange sort of language. From the wound that births aftermath springs two more stories, a winged horse and a name like metal. Pegasus erupts from the place of violence, white and impatient and beautiful as a promise, and beside him a son of the sea rises as a reminder that creation often blooms from destruction. These births are not consolatory in the simple sense, they are reminders that endings are also beginnings, and that the violent line between them is not always moral. The creation of something exquisite from something horrific forces the listener to hold paradox like a warm stone. To see Medusa die is to confront the ethics of myth. Was the killing necessary? Was it a liberation or the triumph of fear? Those questions do not have a simple answer, and the text of the world prefers narratives with neat endings. But life resists neatness. The silence that follows the act of slaying contains the weight of everything that was not spoken into being. Perseus carries the head because he must prove what he has done, because trophies in that world are the currency of stories. But each time the head is lifted it brings along the memory of a face that once wanted nothing more than to be seen as a woman and not a lesson. He strings the head into his backpack like a secret the size of a stone. The return journey is as much a pilgrimage as an escape, and the world feels different now that he carries a thing whose weight is both physical and metaphysical. Wherever he walks, people recoil or wonder, not always able to name the source of their terror. The head is both weapon and relic, and Athena will later take it to become an emblem that sits across shields and breastplates like a warning. The myth freezes it into an image used to intimidate enemies, yet behind that image is the texture of a life that was not allowed to continue. Medusa's body is buried under many kinds of silence. The island keeps secret the last breaths she might have taken, and the world fills the silence with stories that suit it. In some retellings she is honored after death as a kind of warning carved into stone. In others she is forgotten, the way grief sometimes erases itself under the weight of new tasks. Still, her story travels beyond the island in forms she could not have predicted, in paintings, in whispers, in the faces of those who turn away from what they cannot look at. These echoes testify to the fact that myths are living things, changing as we move them through our hands. Perseus returns to kingship into a world whose politics do not end simply because a monster has fallen. His arrival carries complication in its wake. He uses the head to defeat enemies and to settle disputes because power is most easily proved by a single incontrovertible act. Yet trophies have a way of making gods comfortable and men dangerous, and the head becomes a kind of litmus test for who will look and who will be blinded by fear. It is a tool that alters more than battlefields, it rearranges alliances and reputations. Andromeda's chain is undone not because Perseus needs another conquest, but because destiny likes a neat string of favors. He rescues a princess from a beast, using the head as a decisive argument, and their marriage becomes another spoke in the wheel of inherited stories. That scene is not merely a romantic escape but a consolidation of legend. Perseus's acts reverberate into lineage, and thus myth turns into inheritance. The gory geometry of ancient tales is often polished by the needs of dynasties, and so personal violence becomes public pedigree. Medusa's head becomes a motif, a device grafted onto the regalia of gods and kings. Athena sets it on her aegis so that the face of the world can carry a reminder in its armor. The head watches without blinking, and in the stylized world of tassels and cloth it is turned into a symbol of protection rather than an emblem of a woman wronged. This is where myth collides with propaganda. Images are repurposed to justify safety fears and the slow accumulation of power. What was once a private wound is turned into a public talisman. Across centuries, the image of Medusa and Perseus stretches and constricts, becoming everything from a moral tale to an emblem of fashion. Artists will paint the moment of the strike, poets will argue about culpability, and designers will reproduce the ghastly visage as an ornament to ward off bad luck. Each adaptation is an act of translation. The original notes of pain and complexity are simplified into motifs that can be hung on a temple or printed on a coin. In this way, the story survives by shedding inconvenient pieces, and what remains is what future listeners expect to hear. But there are those who will resist the simple renditions, those who listen for the parts that the mainstream versions cut away. Scholars and storytellers and angry daughters will ask the names that have been smoothed over. They will say, "What was Medusa before her snakes? What did she hope for?" They will ask how stories treat women who are hurt, and how the collective imagination crafts monsters from wounded flesh. These questions alter the hearing of the myth, because once you begin to seek the lost parts you will find them in the margins where the old tale sputtered and never quite explained. In modern retellings, Medusa becomes a figure not only of terror but of empathy. Writers and painters who listen closely imagine her life as a continuum of experiences, small domestic pleasures, friendships with her sisters, private hopes that the world dismissed. They imagine the dignity taken from her by the gods, and the shame laid upon her like a public robe. Then they return to the decapitation and ask whether the man who cut the chain of her life was a liberator or something else entirely. These retellings do not always agree, but they agree on one thing: the myth's moral center is not as fixed as the earliest tellers claimed. There is a physics to the gaze in this tale that is worth describing plainly. To look directly upon Medusa is to be changed by sight. That is the myth's central mechanism. The danger is literalized into petrifaction, but in human terms it stands in for something more complicated: the ways trauma can freeze those who witness it, the ways voyeurism can immobilize both spectator and spectacle. The reflective method Perseus uses, seeing without being seen, becomes a metaphor for the careful study of horrors and the ethical labor required to hold them at a distance. To use reflection is to insist that the world can be viewed without consuming the viewer. Mirrors in this story are not just props but moral instruments. They ask the user to think about mediation. How do we observe terrible things without becoming collaborators in their terribleness? Perseus's shield is a literal solution and an ethical parable. It demonstrates that technology and strategy can mitigate harm, but it also shows that mitigation does not erase consequence. The sword still cuts, the head is still taken, and the world still rearranges itself to accommodate the act. Reflection saves Perseus from immediate calamity but does not spare him the cost of his decisions. The motif of blood is handled with similar complexity. Blood in myths is both signifier and maker of lineage, proof of violence and source of life. When Medusa's blood falls into the sand, it does not simply mark death, it creates new beings who will carry fragments of that violence into the world. In that way, blood becomes an argument against simple morals. Violence produces continuations that cannot be predicted, and these consequences make the moral picture messy. Myths flatten this complexity only when listeners let them, and so to read the tale closely is to keep watching the ripples. Consider now the quiet spaces after action, the parts of the story that are not rewards or punishments but cleanup. Legends rarely spend much time on the tidy up, who buries the dead, who stitches the wounds, who remembers the names. Yet those small acts are where compassion lives. If you imagine Perseus resting after his return, you also imagine him trying to make sense of what he has done, and perhaps better versions of the tale let him sit with the memory of Medusa's face and wonder. It is in these quiet moments of narrative that we can imagine human regret, and regret is the slowest kind of learning myth can offer. The role of divine will in all this is both central and ambiguous. Athena's wrath and Hermes' help are motivations and justifications that float above human concerns like a sky. They grant tools and render verdicts, but they are not infallible. Gods in these stories are subject to motives that mirror human misinterpretations, protectiveness twisted into authoritarianism, prudence turned into cruelty. That the immortals can be flawed makes their interventions more interesting and more ominous. When they give gifts, they are also making claims on human bodies and choices. Legacy is what happens after the drumbeat of action stops. Perseus becomes a name in genealogies and marble, and Medusa becomes both a fear and a brand. The ways later cultures appropriate their images tell us as much about those cultures as they do about the original myth. When Medusa's face is used as a symbol to ward off danger, the intention may be different from what her story asks us to feel. Nevertheless, symbols evolve by adoption. This evolutionary truth about storytelling explains why myths survive. They are malleable enough to bear new meanings across epochs. There are modern reinterpretations that make Medusa into a feminist icon, a symbol of rage reshaped into power. These reinterpretations reclaim the narrative, insisting on her personhood instead of her monstrosity. They also turn Perseus into a more ambiguous figure, a man whose heroism is complicated by the origin of the violence he employs. Whether you agree with such reframings depends on which parts of the myth you choose to center. What matters is that myths are not fossilized, they grow and learn like people do. You might wonder why humans keep telling this story over and over. Perhaps it is because it is about seeing and being seen, about justice and the ways it can be perverted, about the instruments we use when we are told we must do what is dreadful. It combines elements that feel like a thought experiment and a morality play. It lets listeners practice discerning their own eyes in relation to others' suffering. That practice can be uncomfortable because it asks us not only to watch but to feel accountable for what our watching does. Consider too the aesthetic pleasure the myth provides, the architecture of tension, the neatness of tools, the contrast between a hero's quickness and a monster's stillness. The tale satisfies a human appetite for narrative closure and for the drama of confrontation. Yet that satisfaction often glosses over the subtleties that lurk beneath, and that is why retellings keep arriving to poke at the seams. Each new version asks a slightly different question about ethics, about the distribution of culpability, about the way power migrates through stories. Listening to many versions in succession is to watch a debate performed for centuries. It is important to say something about the physicality of places in this story because geography often acts like a secondary character. The island where the Gorgons live is described in winds and in the cartography of fear, and Perseus's route is marked by thresholds and small temples. The settings are not neutral, they press upon the protagonists and shape their moods and choices. The sea is not only background but a force that frames the myth, open to possibility, indifferent to human drama, and indifferent in a way that is both terrifying and freeing. Places in myth are repositories of memory. Do not forget the role of those who tell these stories. Bards and mothers and judges pass things down differently. Where a storyteller chooses to emphasize violence, the audience receives a warning. Where a parent accentuates pity, the audience learns empathy. So the myth lives in transmission, changing tone and focus with each teller. The oral nature of these narratives allows them to become mirrors for the times, and that adaptability is why the tale of Perseus and Medusa still matters. There are motifs in the story that reach across other myths like ligatures tying different tales together, the theft of a magical eye, the use of reflection, the birth of winged horses from blood. These recurring elements suggest that ancient storytellers like to reweave the same threads into new patterns. They did so because repetition comforts memory and because motifs serve as shorthand for complex ideas. Recognizing these patterns lets us place this tale within a larger tapestry of human concerns about sight, violence, and the consequences of divine meddling. I want you also to imagine Medusa's voice if she could speak it now, unmediated by the chorus of manifestos and marble. Imagine her telling you about the day her fate turned, about being walked into a temple and finding her body claimed as a battleground. Imagine the private anger, the public shaming, the slow petrification of friends who could not or would not help. Even if we cannot hear that voice in the oldest sources, hearing it in our imagination does not violate the text, it enriches it. To speculate about her interiority is to practice empathy and to resist the flattening that myth often imposes. Perseus' inner life is also worth attending to beyond his deeds. He is not merely a hero whose actions are justified by the gods, he is a man who must live with a choice that changed another person forever. It is plausible to imagine him questioning the righteousness of his act, to imagine sleepless nights and a restlessness that the spoils of victory never soothe. To humanize him is not to excuse him but to complicate him in the way good stories should. Heroes in myth become more instructive when they contain contradictions. Across versions, artists will pick different moments to freeze and admire. Some focus on the instant of the strike, choosing the high drama of violence. Others prefer the aftermath, the cool wash of grief and the odd beauty of creatures that spring from tragedy. Each choice changes what the listener is asked to feel and to think. It is as though the tale asks the audience to rotate a gemstone and notice how its facets change the light, and every new angle is a different moral test. We also should note how this story interacts with themes of punishment and blame. The ancients often found it convenient to punish those who had been violated rather than the violator, and Medusa's transformation is a classic example. By turning a woman into a monster, culture renders her culpable for the damage done to her. That pattern is not just ancient, it is an ongoing human temptation to simplify messy moral economies into single objects of blame. Medusa's tale, then, serves as a cautionary mirror for how societies displace accountability. In many ways, the myth offers a meditation on the limits of intervention. The gods intervene, kings command, and heroes act, but none of those interventions restore what was lost. They rearrange facts and make new monuments, but they cannot bring back a life or undo a violation. This sobering observation can make the story a vehicle for discussing modern ethics. We work with what is possible, we invent instruments to mitigate suffering, yet history shows us that some harms are not reparable and whole. A narrative that accepts this limitation invites us to think harder about repair and restitution. Then there is the question of aesthetic fascination with the monstrous. Why does the human imagination keep drawing and saving the horrifying? Part of it is the pleasure of being outraged at a safe distance, the same thrill that fills audiences at a theater. Part of it is an attempt to analyze fear as if fear could be taken apart and examined under glass. The myth of Medusa offers a controlled encounter with horror. It lets us explore violent transformations inside the tidy frame of a tale. That controlled exploration can be ethically fraught, but it is undeniably human. Language in the myth itself is slippery. Words like monster, justice, and victim shift meaning depending on who says them. When an oracle speaks, its words have a ring of inevitability balanced on the thin reed of interpretation. When a king pronounces a decree, it sounds like law even if it is motivated by vanity. The tale thereby becomes an exercise in reading language critically, noticing how certain words are deployed to justify or excuse. That exercise is itself a kind of ethical literacy, and the myth serves as a classroom for that training. You may notice how often mirrors, shields, and reflections appear across human stories. They are not arbitrary props, but metaphors for the acts of interpretation and self-examination we constantly undergo. In the myth, the shield is material. In our lives, the shield might be journalism, legislation, or therapy, the things we use to look at horrors without collapsing into them. The lesson to take is not that representation is neutral, but that representation is powerful. How we look at each other shapes what we do next. There is also a thread in modern art where Medusa has been reclaimed as a symbol of female rage that refuses to be sanitized. Artists make her face not a deterrent but a statement. Look at me, see my pain and my power at once. This reclaiming is not merely a political stance but an aesthetic revaluation. It challenges audiences to confront what they have been trained to fear and invites them to reconsider whether that fear was ever deserved. Reclaiming becomes a kind of narrative repair work, not by erasing the violence but by rearranging its focus. Perseus's mythic afterlife is complex too. He is celebrated for his cunning and bravery, but later stories sometimes question the cost of his cunning and the ethics of using a weapon born of divine consent. The story will follow him into rulership and legacy and sometimes repentance. It is natural for cultures to wonder if their heroes are truly heroes, and thus they return to the tales and annotate them with doubt. Those doubts are a sign of cultural health. A civilization that interrogates its heroes is a civilization that is listening. To sit with this myth is to practice patience and nuance. It resists the tidy binaries that are so tempting when we teach children a moral lesson. Instead, it asks us to hold two truths simultaneously. Medusa was harmed and then harmed others through being transformed. Perseus performed a necessary act and carried the weight of a violent proof. Gods intervened in complicated matters without offering true restitution. These simultaneous truths make the story enduring because they mirror actual human conflict, which seldom divides cleanly into hero and villain. Imagine now the ways the tale is retold in the hush of late hours, and voices that value complexity. Mothers may tell small parts of it to warn or console, while scholars unpack its politics in lecture halls. Poets will reclaim lines and phrases, turning them into something intimate and untidy. The story's life in these different registers makes it a communal artifact, one that is adapted and readapted for needs the original tellers could not have predicted. Its survival is testament to its ability to contain and provoke thought. If you listen for the moral of the story, you might find it slippery. There is no single moral that covers all the edges. Instead, there are multiple lessons nested like matryoshka dolls. Be careful what you make of suffering. Be wary of gods who prescribe punishment rather than justice. Reflect before you act. And consider how images of power perpetuate themselves. These nested lessons are less like a law and more like an ethical toolkit, offering questions rather than answers. That quality is why the myth remains a useful companion to thinking about modern dilemmas. Finally, consider how the tale asks us to think about legacy and ownership. Whose story is it when a woman is turned into a symbol? Who profits when a head becomes a badge on a shield? Who decides whether an act is heroism or theft? These are uncomfortable but necessary questions. The myth does not solve them for us, but it places them on the table and invites us to argue, to listen, and perhaps, to change how we tell our own stories going forward. There is a moment in every myth when motion meets finality, when the threaded story of a life stutters and then rewrites itself into an object that speaks in deeds rather than words. For Medusa, that instant was both an ending and a strange continuation, the slice of a sword that severed breath while illuminating a power that refused to be contained by mortality. What followed was not silence but transformation, an uncanny persistence that would ripple through temples and shields, through coins and stories, long after the body that once breathed and wept had stilled. The tale of Medusa often opens with serpents and hair, but the true wonder begins with the head, that small, terrible vessel of return. When Perseus lifted the trophy, using Athena's mirror to hide his gaze, he thought of victory and favor, the brass ring of a quest completed. He could not have guessed that the severed head would continue to act in the world, a captive talisman that exercised agency, altered fates, and forced people to reckon with what power could do when detached from the mortal owner's consent. In the instant the blade bit through, there was a double motion, death and release. The body that had been cursed by the gods fell, but the gaze, that monstrous faculty, did not expire with the heartbeat. It lived on as a force that could petrify, paralyze, and turn living flesh into stone, a literalization of the way a look can stop you, make you immobile, compel you to behold and be transformed. To imagine the head alive after death is to imagine a stubbornness so absolute that it resists boundary itself. Within myths, objects sometimes inherit the passions of their owners. The severed head of Medusa becomes a concentrated essence of her rage, her grief, and the divine violence that shaped her. It is not merely an instrument, it is a bearer of memory, a voice that speaks without sound by altering the world itself. This persistence made the head more than a trophy. Perseus tucked it into a bag to carry it safely, as if the contraption were a womb for a dangerous seed. The bag, called the cabesus, transformed a violent relic into something transportable and secret, and in that small gesture we glimpse a relationship between human care and supernatural threat, as if to suggest that power, when contained, becomes useful and when released becomes catastrophic. The ancient poets delighted in details of the head in motion. They told how when Perseus showed it to a wicked king, the tyrant hardened into a statue mid-speech, forever frozen as a warning to others. The drama of a single glance ending a life without bloodshed is a kind of moral punctuation, a demonstration that power can be punitive without the messy business of battle, and that an image can do the work of law or vengeance. When Athena accepted the head and fixed it to her aegis, the story shifted from private trophy to public defense. The goddess who had once consigned Medusa to a monstrous fate transformed the head into an emblem that warded off enemies. In that act, the severed head took on a new social function. It became protective, apotropaic, a paradoxical shield made from the very thing it might have otherwise been used to attack. The aegis itself is an image of authority, but with Medusa's face upon it, authority becomes frighteningly intimate. The blank stare that petrified strangers also warded off ill will toward cities and armies, and the Gorgonean, as that emblem was called, appeared on shields, temple doors, and armor. Citizens stepping into sanctuaries encountered a vision meant to dissuade sacrilege, to transform sacrilegious intent into stone before it could be acted upon, a stern and inexorable deterrent. Coins and pottery took up Medusa's visage and carried it into everyday exchange. People who never visited the oceanic castles of the gods might nonetheless meet her face each time they paid for bread or drank from her kylix. These small reproductions domesticized the terror, democratized the mythology, and in the process made everyday life a theater of protection in which the threat was always visible and therefore, paradoxically, less likely to strike. Artworks made from the head's likeness handled an odd tension between beauty and horror. Sculptors and painters rendered hair that was also a nest of serpents, an expression that was both alarmingly fierce and composed into an almost classical serenity. That ambiguity allowed viewers to contemplate Medusa in multiple ways, as an aesthetic object, as a symbol of dangerous knowledge, and as an instrument of divine will pressed into the service of human cities. Scholars have long tried to name the head's power, to categorize it as something between magic and metaphor. To say that Medusa petrified righteously is to miss how complicated that petrification was. Sometimes it punished, sometimes it protected, sometimes it was used for show, and sometimes it was feared as an autonomous hazard. The head's capacity to be repurposed by heroes and gods alike made it a kind of moral chameleon, bending to the needs and justifications of those who wielded it. If the head functioned as a public shield, it also functioned as a private mirror. Medusa's visage forced onlookers to confront what it meant to be seen without consent, to be known and frozen by another's perception. For victims and survivors across cultures and centuries, that stare reads like an ethical problem: how to live when the possibility of being reduced to an object is real, and how to wrest agency back from a gaze that defines you. Perseus's use of the head complicates the narrative of heroic conquest. He did not simply slay a monster and return triumphant. He carried with him a fragment of divine cruelty and placed it in the world as both weapon and decoration. He used it to incapacitate foes whose crimes were political, to petrify a king who had attempted to marry forcibly, and to change landscapes by turning those who refused hospitality into mountains. That practical use shows how trophies can become tools that structure politics and geography alike. An overlooked detail in the myths is that Medusa was once mortal, a woman whose life ended in a violence that was both intimate and divine. She had been a temple-bound figure and a victim of a god's aggression, and that history complicates the optics of her head's posthumous agency. To regard the severed head only as a weapon is to forget the person who once bore it and to ignore how divine narratives turned victimhood into monstrousness in order to rationalize their own appetites. That tension between victim and monster, between created curse and inherited power, has made Medusa a potent figure for modern reinterpretation. Feminist readings have reclaimed her as a symbol of violated womanhood transformed into a source of indomitable defense. In these retellings, the severed head becomes a metaphor for self-defense, for the reclamation of a gaze that once victimized and now protects. An emblem of survivors' resilience that stares down predators without flinching. The idea of a head continuing to act after death provokes philosophical musings about identity. Where does a person end and an artifact begin, and can the parts of a person possess agency once separated? The severed head of Medusa pushes against simple answers by acting as if personhood can survive a brutal division, by wielding influence and fear as if it were still animated by the woman who once wore it. Ancient audiences may not have obsessed over metaphysical boundaries the way modern theorists do, but they were fascinated by the implications for fate and causality. If a head can halt a man in mid-word, then speech, action, and even history can be interrupted. The Gorgonian's power to freeze becomes a metaphor for the unpredictable ways that events can be reversed or postponed, for how a single revelation can change the direction of an entire life. Temples that displayed the image of Medusa did so with a sense of ritual seriousness. The iconography was not decorative in the benign sense, but part of a landscape of power meant to keep sacred spaces inviolate. Those who worshipped there were under the protection of a terror that knew how to translate sacrilege into immobility, and the community was bound together by the knowledge that a look could stand between them and catastrophe. Though the severed head's gaze was primarily destructive, it also had a creative afterlife. From the wound at Medusa's neck sprang creatures, Pegasus, winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior, symbols of speed and ferocity born from violence. That birth from the aftermath of death suggests that destruction and genesis can be entangled. That endings sometimes give rise to abilities and beings that reconfigure the world in ways the actors could not have anticipated. The very idea of birth from severed flesh carries a strange, almost botanical logic. Think of a seed released by the rupture of a pod or a bulb pushing up through winter, and the image is not so far from the mythic biology that gave Pegasus to the air. The severed head, then, is less an ending than a kind of fulcrum, a point where one narrative flips and another begins, where the energies of past violence are rerouted into new, sometimes benevolent forms. Over centuries, Medusa's head accumulated cultural accretions like barnacles. It became a motif in medieval marginalia, a warning in Renaissance painting, and a subject in modern novels and films. Each epoch projected its anxieties onto the Gorgonian, and the head's meaning shifted with each projection. What remained constant was its capacity to command attention and to function as a shorthand for forces that could immobilize or protect at a glance. Artists have been particularly drawn to the challenge of rendering a face that is both terrifying and tragically human. Painters in the Renaissance rendered Medusa with a face that balanced retribution and sympathy, showing a visage in which the pain of the mortal life and the monstrous aftermath both live. Those brushstrokes invite viewers to feel the complexity of what it means to be both victim and emblem, both person and instrument. The head's appearances in literature often dwell on its moral ambiguity. Poets have used the image to explore themes of silence and speech, of looking and being looked at, of the costs of power. By invoking Medusa, they dramatize what happens when observation becomes domination, when to be seen is to be rendered inert, and when the tools of protection can double as instruments of oppression. Medusa's head also suggests something about the ethics of spectacle. When communities display fearsome images to discourage harm, they perform a kind of shrill theater in which the threat is visible and, paradoxically, somewhat domesticated. The gaze that could kill is made into an everyday icon, and the very act of seeing it repeatedly diminishes the terror somewhat, even as it perpetuates the logic that fear can be institutionalized. The head's journey through myth shows how power migrates and is repurposed. It moves from goddess to hero to public emblem and back again, changing function while retaining a core capability. That migration is instructive about how artifacts in any culture can be wrested from their origins and pressed into new uses, reflecting contemporary priorities more than original intentions. The tactile reality of carrying a severed head is an image that both fascinates and unsettles. Perseus's cabesus packed the head like a dangerous treasure, moving it across seas and mountains. That act of containment hints at a human desire to control what terrifies us, to put chains around forces we do not understand and to transport them where they can be useful or admired, transforming fear into capital. Even the practicalities of using a head as a weapon reveal something intimate about the human imagination. The idea that you could show someone a face and stop their body mid-motion is a dramatic compression of legal proceedings, argument, and punishment into a single, irreversible act. It is the equivalent of executing judgment with a picture, a hyperbolic metaphor for the potency of images in enforcing norms. As the head traveled, it collected stories that emphasized different aspects of its power. Some tales focused on the comic, as when people were turned to stone in absurd poses, memorials to folly. Others insisted on the tragic, noting the sorrow wrapped into a visage that once knew tenderness. Together, those stories made the head a polyvalent symbol, able to answer whichever cultural need a storyteller wished to address. The notion of petrification can be read psychologically as well as physically. To be turned to stone can stand for an emotional freeze, a defensive withdrawal that halts development and expression. In this sense, Medusa's head becomes a metaphor for trauma, a look, an event, or a memory that arrests movement and forces the sufferer into a state of suspended life. In myths of ritual and magic, objects with agency often demand respect and ritualized handling. Medusa's head was no exception. Those who carried it had to be careful not to misuse it, mindful that wielding a power that could end life without blood was a responsibility that blurred law and metaphysics. The use of the head in combat scenes in poetry and drama underlines a moral paradox. Displaying the head was a nonviolent way of winning a conflict, showing it was equivalent to defeating an enemy without deploying armies. It raises questions about the aesthetics of domination. What does it mean to be defeated by an image rather than by force? And why are such defeats sometimes more humiliating precisely because they are so immediate and theatrical? Medusa's head also survived as a motif in personal amulets. People wore small depictions to ward off the evil eye, invoking the very thing that could petrify to keep themselves safe. In this inversion, what is dangerous becomes protective, a transfer of threat that turns the logic of horror on its head and entrusts individual safety to a sign that once embodied danger. The presence of the head in funerary art is telling. To place the Gorgonian near graves was to ensure that even in death a boundary remained between the deceased and the possible violator. It suggests an aftercare for the dead, a belief that images can guard passageways and protect the vulnerable in liminal states, much as the severed head guarded passages between life and death. Medusa's head is also a study in the aesthetics of terror. Artists who capture its stare must decide whether to emphasize monstrousness or pathos, to show teeth in a snarl or pain in the eyes. Those choices reflect cultural attitudes toward otherness, toward punishment, and toward the possibility that the monstrous is also intimately recognizably human. Across centuries, philosophers have used Medusa to discuss knowledge and ignorance. To look at the head and be petrified is analogous to coming face to face with unbearable truth. The metaphor implies that some truths are so disruptive that they halt ordinary life, call into question previous certainties, and force a culture to freeze while it reorients. From the ancient Greeks to modern film directors, storytellers have been drawn to the seductive logic of a glance that changes everything. In a moment of concentrated symbolism, Medusa's head can do the heavy lifting of myth. It stands for injustice, for the weight of trauma, and for the way societies attempt to fix those problems by turning them into images that can be pointed to and thereby managed. The head is an ethical tool as much as a magical one, a device for memory and control. One cannot discuss the severed head without thinking of sound and silence. The head has no tongue to speak, yet it communicates more surely than any speech could by stopping others mid-sentence. In that arrested quiet there is an irony, ultimate communicative power achieved by eliminating the other's voice, a commentary on how force can substitute for reason in political life. The head also invites medical metaphors. Physicians in later eras used the image of petrification to name conditions in which the body stiffens, muscles bind, and action is hindered. In such comparisons, mythic metaphors become explanatory tools, and cultural stories about a petrifying gaze are enlisted to give shape to otherwise opaque symptoms, lending mythic resonance to clinical descriptions. Stories of Medusa's gaze sometimes focus on the aftermath, how communities cope with sudden petrification. Carved rocks and men turned to stone posed a problem of aesthetics and of utility. What do you do with living statues? In some accounts, these stone creatures become markers in the landscape, landmarks that instruct future travelers and serve as moral tales about hospitality and hubris. Medusa's mythology also intersects with geopolitics. Some tales have her head frozen on the horizon to warn invading armies, a literal fortification that replaces walls with fear. The head's service as an instrument of deterrence anticipates modern debates about the ethics of preemptive security. Is it right to advertise devastation to prevent it? And does such a display make violence more likely by normalizing it? Perseus's conscience receives little attention in many renditions, but there are hints of ambivalence. Carrying a severed head, even for noble ends, weighs on the soul in mythic narratives, as if heroes cannot avoid internal accounting. That ambivalence complicates the idea of a clean victory, reminding listeners that power obtained by violence tends to carry a smell of blood and the residue of ethical doubt. Some myths transform the head itself into something that can be negotiated with. In certain versions, the head can be shown briefly to avert danger and then rehidden, a ritualized exchange in which sight is power traded for protection. The ritual handling turns the head into a communal resource, to be summoned at need and restrained at all other times, a practice that turns terror into a regulated instrument. The historically specific use of the Gorgonian on armor connects the mythical with the material. Fighting men who marched beneath its image carried not only protective gear but also a solemn self-image as part of a tradition that sanctioned their violence. To wear Medusa was to put oneself under the aegis of a gaze that acknowledged no quarter and offered no mercy, a promise of absolute deterrence against enemies. On a personal level, the image of Medusa's severed head can be a way to think about grief. Bereavement freezes the mourner in a cavern of shock, and the analogy of being turned to stone captures that sudden immobility. Yet even within that paralysis, something else may grow. Memory solidifies into monument, sorrow shapes into a durable marker that persists through time, and like the head, the mourner learns to carry what was once living into a different kind of presence. The head also prompts questions about visibility and agency in gendered terms. Historically, patriarchal narratives used monstrous female figures to police sexual boundaries and to justify violence against women. Medusa's transformation and the subsequent wielding of her head have therefore been read as symbolic of male control over female bodies and the appropriation of female rage for public purposes. Modern reworkings often try to reclaim the image, making it a site of resistance rather than subjugation. Another persistent theme is the disjunction between image and intention. Medusa's frozen face cannot explain itself, it cannot narrate the injustice it suffered, and so its use as a punitive instrument gains moral cover simply because it remains mute. The silencing of the victim is embedded in the trophy, and recognizing that fact forces us to question the rhetoric of victory that celebrates trophies without accounting for their source. The severed head, in its long career, has also become an emblem of memory. Cities and families who kept relics often attached stories to them, stories that served to teach younger generations. The head's capacity to arrest a moment, an insult, a crime, a sacrilege, and make it permanent turned private grievance into communal lesson, a pedagogy of fear and vigilance. We can also read the head through the lens of performance. To show the Gorgonian was to stage a moment of moral theater in which spectators were compelled to witness the consequences of transgression. Rituals that involve displaying threatening images are essentially performances meant to rehearse the city's boundaries and to remind participants of what is forbidden. Religious practice sometimes made the head into a functional particle of divinity. When placed on altars or breathed upon in rites, the image was not inert but charged with sacred energy that could be invoked during crises. That sacralization turned a violent symbol into a sacramental object, reorienting its meaning from vengeance to consecration. The psychology of possessing a dangerous relic also matters. Those who held the head might feel a sense of ultimate security mixed with a growing paranoia about misuse. Power concentrated into an object often breeds fear of theft, betrayal, or contamination, and so the keeper of the severed head becomes a guardian whose identity is shaped as much by fear as by authority. There is a strange intimacy in stories where someone uses the head to petrify loved ones who betray them. These narratives dramatize the terrible logic of absolute retaliation in personal relationships, a logic that has always worried moral thinkers. How far may one go to enforce loyalties? And does the use of overwhelming force on intimate grounds destroy the possibility of repair? In the theater of myth, the severed head also functions as a test of character. Heroes who wield it must show restraint and judgment, for the head does not discriminate between right and wrong, it petrifies according to sight alone. That neutrality makes it morally treacherous, a tool that can easily become an instrument of injustice if brought to bear without deliberation. The head's presence in folk tales sometimes veers toward the macabre and the humorous at once. Anecdotes in which unwary travelers turn to stone in comic poses play with the seriousness of the motif, allowing audiences to laugh at the folly of those who would approach danger without respect or caution. Such tales teach practical lessons through exaggerated consequence while softening the terror with a levity that makes the moral stick. Philologists and historians have traced how the Gorgonian changed in depiction over time, from grotesque, wide-eyed terrors to more serene, even sympathetic faces in later periods. This visual evolution reflects shifting sensibilities. What once served as prophylactic horror was later smoothed into an emblem of aesthetic order. The shift tells us about taste as well as about the politics of fear. Societies gradually domesticated the monstrous to make fear palatable. In psychoanalytic readings, Medusa's head stands in for the return of repressed material, the moment when something a person or culture has suppressed bursts into the open and arrests functioning. The petrifying gaze is a metaphor for the shock of reemergence, the moment when buried truths become visible and the subject is unable to continue along previous patterns. It is a potent image for the way the past can freeze the present into stasis. Even in modern fantasy, the trope of the petrifying gaze persists, sometimes as homage and sometimes as reinvention. Writers and filmmakers play with the metaphor, making it technological, psychic, or even environmental. A poison, a virus, a viral image can function like Medusa's stare. The head's essence adapts easily to contemporary anxieties about what can incapacitate us without direct violence, from misinformation to surveillance. Critics of modern culture have also used Medusa as a model for thinking about representation. The head forces us to ask how images function politically, how they can immobilize populations, and how visual culture can be deployed as a method of control. In that inquiry, the severed head is a cautionary tale about the moral economy of images, reminding us to examine who controls images and to what ends. The severed head's afterlife in ritual law deserves attention. In some narratives, legal claims are settled by displaying the head as evidence of guilt, an extraordinary move that bypasses courts in favor of the spectacle. Such uses reveal tensions between communal justice and ritual authority, between the messy deliberation of law and the tidy finality of symbolic punishment. Language itself has absorbed the image of Medusa into metaphors about paralysis. To be Medusied is to be frozen by shock, to be turned to stone by a revelation that cannot be integrated. That linguistic usage keeps the myth alive in everyday metaphors and allows the figure to function as a shorthand for emotional states. The severed head thus haunts not only iconography but also the way we habitually talk about being stopped in our tracks. Stories about Medusa's head traveling through time prompt reflections on cultural inheritance. Each generation inherits symbols that have been stripped of context and retooled for contemporary needs. And the head serves as a prime example of how something can outlive its original story and accumulate meanings that authors and audiences never intended. The head becomes a palimpsest of human concerns, each layer revealing as much about interpreters as about origins. In speculative retellings, the head sometimes regains voice, and its speech can be a device for confronting past injustices. When the severed head is allowed to narrate, myths shift toward restitution and testimony, and audiences are invited to hear the previously silenced subject. That narrative move is deeply political. It gives back agency and insists upon the ethical necessity of listening to the mutilated and the marginal. Finally, the severed head is a reminder of the unpredictable ways that power continues after death. It demonstrates that violence does not end with a body, but can leave behind structures, images, laws, rituals that keep acting on the living. To study Medusa's head is to study how cultures manage, repurpose, and narrate power. It is to enter a long conversation about protection, punishment, memory, and the tense boundary between life and the forces we leave behind. And in that long conversation, listeners are invited to keep the image with them, not as a relic of blood and blade, but as a symbol of endurance. The severed head tells us about the cost of being seen and the possibilities of protecting what has been damaged. It offers a balance between the terror of immobilization and the stubborn survival of meaning, an enigmatic relic that continues to stare out of history and into our present with an insistence that refuses to be ignored. There is a moment in every myth when a single image refuses to be left behind, a face, a stare, a shock of writhing snakes. That image is Medusa, a woman whose name has echoed from the lip of ancient storytellers into the lights of modern billboards, from the carved frieze of a ruined temple to the cold sheen of a shield in a royal collection. Listen and you will hear more than a story about a monster. You will hear a history of how people make sense of power, danger, beauty, and punishment. The legacy of Medusa stretches and coils across centuries like the very serpents that crown her head, always dangerous to meet but never easy to forget. Origins of a fearful name are slippery because myths twist as they pass from voice to voice. In the oldest Greek accounts, the Gorgons are daughters of sea deities, born of Phorcys and Ceto on the misty margins of the world. They are Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, three sisters who embody different degrees of dread. Medusa alone is mortal in many tellings, which is what allows a mortal hero to meet her and bring the tale to its sharp, decisive end. The earliest lines that reach us are spare on detail but enormous in consequence. The Gorgons are terrible in visage, their faces so fearsome that a glance could turn a man to stone. Hesiod tells us this in a tone that accepts the monstrous as part of the world's natural order. Yet later poets and painters will fuss with those details. Was she winged, tusked, snout, the color of bronze? And in those small choices entire meanings shift. A wing here or a human hand that changes whether we read her as animal, deity, or a woman punished. Ovid, writing in Rome centuries later, gives the story the particular sorrow that will haunt many modern readings. He makes Medusa once beautiful, a priestess in Athena's temple, and tells of a violent encounter with the sea god that ends with Athena's wrath falling not on the perpetrator but on the victim. Ovid's language fixes the moment of transformation into something tragic and unjust, beauty turned into horror, a human life made exemplary of divine caprice. It is a twist that invites interpretation. Was Medusa punished for being desirable, or for being violated, or for being visible at all? Different tellings keep different details and lose others. In some versions, Medusa is born monstrous, an unchanging emblem of dread. In others, she is a woman who sleeps, loves, or serves, and then is made monstrous by the forked will of gods. That ambivalence is essential to Medusa's durability. She is both origin and outcome, an ancient face created at the world's margin and a placeholder for later people to project their fears. That projection is what turns myth into legacy. The story is not static, it is a mirror. The most famous dramatic knot in her story is the encounter with Perseus, and that sequence is almost cinematic in its clarity. A divinely aided hero, a council of gifts, the helmet of invisibility, winged sandals, a polished shield or mirror, and a final, precise decapitation. Perseus uses the shield like a mirror to avoid looking directly at her, and in the reflected image he sees what would kill him. He cuts and contains the head in a bag, and with it he frees and enslaves power at once. The head remains potent even after the body falls. Perseus' journey reads as a kind of divinely scripted rite. He is sent by a king with a wicked heart. He meets helpers on the way. He returns with a miraculous trophy that will place him beyond ordinary human reach. The head becomes a speaking artifact in many stories, a weapon that can petrify enemies with a glance and a token that proves his heroic legitimacy. Athenians and Romans used such stories to explain the provenance of shields and temple icons, but the underlying image is older and persistent. A living gaze that can fix the living world into stone is an image that arrests the imagination. Athena's role is complicated. She appears alternately as protector, as sponsor, and as a goddess who takes Medusa's still warm head and sets it upon her chest as an aegis. The aegis, with the Gorgonian at its heart, becomes a widely used apotropaic device, an instrument meant to ward off evil by reflecting it, to turn back malice with an even more terrifying face. That logic is almost medicinal. Fear and danger can be neutralized by matching them with greater fear. But another reading is political. Athena appropriates Medusa's power and makes it an instrument of male reason and martial order. From the temples of ancient Greece, the image of Medusa spreads outward and downward through centuries of art and motif. On shield bosses and temple pediments, on the rims of bronze mirrors and the faces of coins, her face is reproduced and sometimes softened, sometimes made grotesque for effect. Artists carve her with snakes and teeth and gazes that break the viewer's expectations. Monumental images fix her as an emblem of the threshold, what lies between inside and outside, safety and hazard, the city and its enemies. A Gorgonian on a doorway is supposed to keep home and hearth intact. In some of the earliest pottery she appears as a wild thing, with a feline mouth and a frontal stare that confronts you without flinching. The frontal, unblinking look is not merely threatening, it establishes a direct relation between image and spectator. You cannot be a casual observer of Medusa. She demands engagement, and that demand is what artists and worshippers responded to. Over time, the wildness will alternate with sorrow, with eroticism, with moral warning. Each variation is a cultural conversation about what the female face can mean. Through the Roman era, the story spreads, retold in different registers. Latin poets and craftsmen reshape Medusa for new purposes, making her a decorative motif and a moral sign. The Metamorphoses of Ovid becomes a touchstone for later European writers, and his version of the tale, that of transformation as a form of unjust punishment, casts a long shadow. As Rome becomes a repository for Greek culture, the image of Medusa becomes a part of a classical vocabulary that artists and thinkers will draw on for millennia. The medieval period treats classical figures oddly. Sometimes they are scorned, sometimes admired, and often used for their symbolic punch. Medusa continues as a grotesque sign on church capitals and in marginalia, where monstrous figures play moral roles in a world uneasy with the body and desire. In illuminated manuscripts she appears as warning, as emblem, a monstrous emblem in the margins that will scare or delight a pious reader. Monstrous female faces in churches are not only pagan residues, they are reminders of sin and the dangers of temptation, recast by a Christian moralism that likes moral portraits tidy and instructive. The Renaissance is a rebirth of looks. Artists return to classical bodies and faces with enthusiasm, but with a new hunger for psychological detail. Caravaggio paints a circular, startlingly lifelike Medusa, her face vivid and wet with terror, eyes open, hair of serpent splayed as if nature itself recoiled. Benvenuto Cellini sculpts Perseus in Florence, a bronze that freezes the exact instant of triumph, the hero poised and the head an object of monumental display. These works transform Medusa into a dramatic actor in stories of control and mastery, and viewers in the city squares are invited to see triumph as spectacle. The Baroque and beyond keep retelling in their own expressive idioms. Rubens and others paint the drama with movement and flesh, while operas and plays borrow the narrative to explore human passions and furies. At each step the balance between sympathy and horror shifts. Sometimes Medusa is monstrous and frightening, sometimes a victim, sometimes a symbol of the feminine that cannot be contained by patriarchal order. The later you move, the more the story seems to reveal what the society that tells it most fears. That is the core of Medusa's power as a legacy. She is a mirror into the anxieties and attractions of each age that takes her up. In the 19th century, poets and painters rummaged through classical myth for echoes of modern sorrow. Romantic temperaments read Medusa through the lens of sublime terror, finding in the monstrous a mirror of the uncontrollable forces of nature and passion. In the 20th century, psychoanalysis offers another frame. The gaze becomes not literal petrifaction but a metaphor for psychological paralysis, trauma, and the freezing effect of fear. Feminist thinkers and artists in the late 20th and early 21st centuries reclaim Medusa with particular intensity. Where earlier readings emphasized terror or punishment, feminist readings emphasize the injustice of her treatment and the political uses of her image. For many, Medusa becomes a symbol of violated women, of presence made dangerous by forces that refuse to reckon with accountability. This is not a uniform reinterpretation, it is a conversation, and different thinkers emphasize victimhood, agency, rage, or symbolic power in different degrees. The conversation becomes public in unexpected ways. In contemporary art and protest, Medusa's head is wielded not as a weapon but as an emblem of exposure and refusal. The visual of a woman whose stare cannot be endured is turned into a metaphor for those who will not be silenced. In that shift, Medusa is no longer only a cautionary tale about looking at forbidden things, she becomes a badge of courage for those who insist on visibility despite consequence. One of the most visible public reckonings with this symbolism came in recent years with sculpture and debate. A sculptor produced a piece that reversed the ancient sequence. Instead of a man holding a woman's severed head, the woman stands with the head of the man. The image resonated with contemporary movements against sexual violence, and for many it was a corrective to centuries of imagery that rewarded male violence and turned women's suffering into trophies. To others it seemed a provocation, and the ensuing back and forth itself demonstrates how powerful the Medusa image still is at provoking public thought. The world of modern mythmaking, film, television, and video games returns again and again to Medusa with a mixture of awe and spectacle. Her image is rendered with digital realism, her snakes hissing in surround sound, her gaze a special effect designed to stun. In these retellings she is sometimes a boss to be defeated, sometimes a tragic figure to be pitied, and sometimes a monstrous test of the hero's mettle. The modern medium often loses the reflective subtlety of old mirrors, but it gains wide circulation. More people now see Medusa on a screen than in a temple or a vase. In popular culture, Medusa's name slips into brand and costume. A luxury fashion house adopts her face as a logo, transforming what was once an apotropaic sign into a symbol of seduction and wealth. The image of the snaky hair becomes an ornament, a provocative badge that promises both beauty and danger. This transformation tells its own story. Ancient talismans of protection become modern emblems of desire and status, and the snake's bite is marketed as part of allure. Medusa's presence in science and nature is another unexpected part of her legacy. Biologists name a life stage of jellyfish Medusa because of its umbrella-like, floating form that contrasts with a sessile, rooted polyp. Here the name travels from myth to taxonomy, trading the idea of a hair of snakes for a soft bell of gelatin. Even in this neutral scientific transfer, the choice of names suggests that mythology still colors how we structure knowledge. We name the world with stories, and our metaphors are not innocent. Even names of species sometimes borrow from the Gorgons. Paleontologists and entomologists have attached classical names to fossils and insects with a fondness for mythic resonance. The ancient world becomes a language for classification, and in naming we become heirs to a tradition that balances fear and fascination. Naming a creature Medusa is to give it a biography before it has been studied, an imaginative frame that precedes observation. In psychology and literary criticism, the image of platings of stone is useful as metaphor. To describe a person as petrified is to describe a state of immobility produced by shock or terror, and that image owes a linguistic debt to Medusa. Writers use this to make vivid the way trauma can turn feeling into paralysis, the way a single look, event, or verdict can arrest a life. But metaphors have danger too. They flatten nuance and can obscure the social causes of trauma by isolating it in the language of the individual gaze rather than the relations that produce harm. Language itself contains echoes. Gorgon became Gorgons in several European tongues as a way of referring to terrible faces, and Medusa has made its way into literary titles and poems as shorthand for a terrifying woman or a frozen moment. Poets and essayists returning to the image often find the paradox thrilling, a face that can both turn men to stone and symbolize women's power. This double edge is what keeps literary critics returning again and again to the same set of images, because Medusa refuses settling into one moral position. The visual arts continue to test her image. Photographers practice with Medusa's stare, sculptors work with her head, and painters translate snake into brushstroke. Each medium demands a different negotiation. Sculpture allows the viewer to walk around the object and confront it from various angles, while a painting or photograph sets a single, immutable frame. Those differences matter because Medusa is not merely what she is depicted as, but how she is depicted. The medium becomes part of the myth. Consider the mirror motif that appears in so many retellings. The shield used by Perseus is a practical mirror, a tool of survival. Later, the mirror becomes a psychological instrument, allowing characters and viewers to see themselves in reflection. Mirrors split subject from object, and the double image of Medusa in a shield suggests that confronting horror is also confronting yourself. That is why the mirror is such a useful and terrifying device across literature and art. It makes complicity visible. Equally important is the question of sight. In a culture that prizes looking as a way to attain truth, Medusa's gaze undermines the whole project. If seeing can kill, then sight is not an innocent truth-telling, it is a weapon and a responsibility. Philosophers, artists, and critics have seized on that inversion to interrogate the ethics of observation. What do we owe one another when we look, and what happens when looking becomes violence? At the center of these debates is a recurring moral hinge: who is culpable and who is punished? Different eras answer this differently. In ancient times, punishment by a goddess like Athena could be read as a capricious cosmic order, and audiences accepted divine retribution as part of the world. Modern audiences, steeped in ideas of individual rights and consent, are more likely to see injustice in Athena's reaction and read Medusa as the wrongly punished. But even modern sympathy has its limits. Sympathizing with Medusa does not erase her terror. She remains a figure of danger, and sometimes she is an instrument of justice rather than pure victimhood. When Perseus uses her head to save Andromeda or to escape enemies, the head functions as an equalizer, a way to turn an oppressive force against its agents. That duality, victim and weapon, punished and powerful, resists simple moralizing and keeps the myth alive in complex ways. The myth also tells us about the anxieties of masculinity. Perseus' triumph is not simply his personal achievement, it is a rite that reaffirms male power by extracting and displaying female power as trophy. The head is a proof of conquest, an emblem of domination that will hang in public as a lesson to others. Feminist readings point out how common that narrative is. Women are often made to be evidence of male heroism, their bodies displayed and catalogued to certify men's bravery. Iconography changes this to suit different cultural needs. In some images, Medusa is grotesque, leering with teeth bared, an anti-erotic creature meant to be feared. In others, she is beautiful, transformed in the very telling into a figure of tragic dignity. The difference between beauty and horror is thin in the myth. Both can be made to justify punishment. That ambiguity is why so many artists are attracted to Medusa. Her two faces allow an exploration of the moral and aesthetic entanglement of fear and desire. Medusa's head placed on Athena's breast, or stamped on a shield, becomes a symbol that both protects and reminds of the means of protection. A city might display a Gorgonian to warn enemies and to exorcise evil. But a civic use of the image is also a political act. It is a claim that power will answer violence with a show of force, that the city has within it an image of annihilation to deter threats. In such civic deployments, the apotropaic device becomes a mark of statecraft as much as piety. Medusa also adapts to modern national narratives. In some modern museums and national collections, her image is a relic of classical heritage, an indication of cultural continuity with antiquity. Nations that construct identity through ancient roots find in Medusa both ornament and origin. That political appropriation can produce pride, but it can also sterilize the more uncomfortable parts of the tale, the moments of injustice, the complexity of agency, the voices of the punished. If museums shape meanings, so too do critical theories. Scholars of myth, gender studies, and psychoanalysis debate whether Medusa is primarily a symbol of castration anxiety, a representation of female abjection, or a sign of righteous revenge. None of these frameworks exhausts the tale, because myths are capacious, they accept multiple interpretations without breaking. A good myth will survive being read many ways because it contains multitudes, and Medusa is full of such contradictory possibilities. Literary retellings often choose to linger on the interior life of Medusa, imagining her feelings in the hours before the transformation, the moments between violation and punishment, the consciousness of a living woman made into an emblem. These narratives attempt to humanize an often objectified figure, to restore speech and thought to the one who in earlier tales became an image. In giving Medusa a voice, writers reverse the ancient silencing that made her an object of terror and take back the narrative. Other retellings reverse the terms of agency and make Medusa an agent of cosmic or political judgment. She becomes an executioner of monsters and tyrants, a figure who uses her gaze to hold brutal forces to account. In those versions, the petrifying look is an instrument of justice, and her monstrous aspect is redefined as righteous severity. These readings are satisfying when justice seems absent from conventional institutions, and so they find traction among readers who want radical revaluations. Beyond literature, theater has staged Medusa in many intriguing ways. Directors choreograph the snakes as costuming problem and symbolic opportunity, using movement and sound to suggest the hum of life in a body that is also a battleground. Actors must negotiate the line between monster and human, and audiences are asked to watch the conflation of horror and pathos. Theater's live presence makes the myth immediate, and performances that highlight Medusa's interiority can reorient the audience to look for empathy rather than mere spectacle. Music and opera have also taken up the story, favoring its drama and emotional extremes. The myth's high stakes, divine meddling, violent transformation, life turned to stone, translate well into musical crescendos and motifs that can mimic the hiss of snakes or the shattering silence of petrifaction. Composers find in Medusa a catalyst for sonic exploration, how to make a sound that arrests the listener in the same way the gaze arrests the body. The result is often uncanny, a mix of seduction and alarm. The academic study of Medusa extends into archaeology, where actual artifacts bearing Gorgonia are analyzed to understand their social function. Archaeologists look at placement, context, and where to reconstruct how ancient people interacted with these images. Were they meant to terrify outsiders, to protect infants, to mark boundaries? The material record offers clues but rarely closes the case, because function interweaves with symbolism and ritual. In museum halls, modern viewers encounter Medusa not as a living threat but as an artifact of layered histories. Plaques offer dates and attribution, but the object's potency often outstrips the label. People stand before Roman mosaics or Greek kylixes and feel an uneasy recognition, as if the face reaches forward through time to meet them. That sensation, of continuity and distance, is the essence of Medusa's legacy. She is familiar enough to be immediate but distant enough to be a riddle. The language of metamorphosis is central to her mythic power. To be turned into stone is to be fixed, memorialized, and erased all at once, fixed in the sense of nailed into place, memorialized in the sense of becoming a monument, erased in the sense that life and motion end. That triple status is what makes the image authoritative and mournful. Medusa becomes an eternal object lesson and a cautionary tale turned into a public monument. Consider how different cultures outside Greece have folded Medusa into their own visual and literary vocabularies. Medieval Islamic art sometimes adapted classical motifs, and later European empires transmitted these images to far corners of the globe. Once globalized, the Gorgon becomes an image that resonates for reasons unrelated to its original context: terror, protection, exoticism. That process is not neutral, it is a history of cultural translation where meanings are often lost, condensed, or amplified. Translation itself is part of the story. When medieval translators rendered Ovid into vernacular languages, they made choices about emphasis and tone that affected how readers understood Medusa. Translators of myth often act as curators of significance, deciding which moral or emotional chord should ring for new audiences. Those small editorial acts accumulate over centuries, so that by the time modern readers pick up a retelling, they are reading an edited lineage of choices and emphases. The law and politics of representation sometimes catch up with Medusa's image. Debates over depicting the head in public spaces touch on broader controversies over displaying violent objects or glorifying one figure's suffering. Is the public display of a severed head historical and instructive, or is it a gratuitous spectacle? These arguments are not purely about taste, they are about memory and power and which histories we choose to make visible in our communal spaces. Medusa also serves as a cautionary echo in medical and ethical discourse. When physicians first discussed certain neurological states, they sometimes borrowed metaphors of petrifaction to describe catatonia or other forms of immobility. Though not precise clinical terminology, the metaphor helps convey the human horror of being trapped in a body that cannot move. Such uses of myth to describe human conditions remind us that stories are often our first resources for making sense of suffering and strangeness. The educational role of myth is another part of her legacy. Teachers who bring Medusa into classrooms can use the tale to explore narrative structure, cultural values, and historical change. A single myth can be a prism through which to teach reading, politics, art history, and ethics simultaneously. Students learn not only the story but how stories evolve, how symbols shift their meanings, and how ancient narratives remain relevant to contemporary debates. Medusa's image also haunts photography and digital art, where the face is used for effect and commentary. Digital artists splice the human with the reptilian, echoing the ancient mix of human and monster. The result is often uncanny and arresting, an intentional provocation that asks viewers to reconceive the boundaries of the human. These images are sometimes playful, sometimes fierce, and they insist that Medusa's visual power continues in the age of pixels. In academic conferences, papers pile up defending and contesting the various readings of Medusa: psychoanalytic, feminist, structuralist, historicist. No single method wins outright because the tale resists being put under a single interpretive lens. Each methodology reveals something while obscuring other things, and that is the work of scholarship, to build partial windows onto a larger phenomenon. Students of myth learn to live with ambiguity because Medusa requires it. Children's books occasionally include tamer versions of the tale, and these adaptations matter because they introduce the motif early. When young readers see Medusa as merely a monster to be conquered, they learn a narrative of heroism and punishment. When they encounter versions that humanize her, they learn a different set of values: empathy, justice, and the politics of blame. How a culture chooses to tell its stories to children matters, because it helps shape moral imagination. Across centuries and cultures, Medusa remains a favorite of artists who want to explore the dangerous intersection of beauty and violence. The image is a perfect allegory for the unstable boundary between attraction and fear. Snakes are sexy in some images and horrific in others, and the face that flips between allure and terror keeps viewers off balance. The tension is productive. Great art will not let us rest comfortably in our assumptions. Even as digital culture remixes and mimifies Medusa, scholarly books keep appearing that ask hard questions about context and continuity. Historians trace the development of the Gorgonian, art historians map stylistic shifts, and philosophers probe the ethics of gaze and representation. Together, these disciplines create a dense web of knowledge that treats Medusa as a figure of endless inquiry rather than merely an old story to be retold. What then is the core of Medusa's immortality? It is not simply that artists like the image, it is that the image adapts to new anxieties. Whenever a culture worries about the dangers of desire, the ethics of gaze, the power of punishment, or the politics of shame, Medusa becomes useful as a symbol. She is a malleable emblem that finds new life in old coils because the concerns she dramatizes remain stubbornly contemporary. To step back, think of Medusa as a conversation device across epochs. She is a portable idea that travels with a cluster of resonances: danger, protection, injustice, female power, objectification, transformation, and artistic provocation. To speak of Medusa is to summon a whole family of human concerns: our fear of what cannot be controlled, our need to label and ward off threat, our impatience with ambiguous agency, and our longing to rewrite stories where wrongs remain unpunished. Her legacy teaches us that myths are not relics but tools. They do not sit quiet in the past, they are picked up and put to work for new purposes. Artists, philosophers, activists, and merchants all use Medusa for their own ends, sometimes in ways that contradict each other, and that contradiction is not a failure but a sign of vitality. A living myth must be contested, and Medusa's survival is evidence of how cultures continue to negotiate what it means to see and be seen. If you look around in the world, on coins, in museums, on logos, in comics, you will find Medusa not as a single, stable figure but as a chorus of variations: victim, villain, protector, aristocratic badge, feminist icon, monster, and a blockbuster. Each version arrests a particular set of anxieties and fashions a response. The neatness of a single answer dissolves when confronted with the proliferation of uses, and that proliferation is itself part of the lesson. Finally, the legacy of Medusa is less about being frozen and more about endurance. The myth that speaks to petrifaction actually keeps moving through time. It assumes new forms and gains new meanings. She is the paradox of stillness that refuses to be still, an image of petrifaction that keeps being remade. That living contradiction is perhaps the most faithful echo of her name. Medusa, who turned others to stone, lives on in 1,000 speaking objects, each of which continues to stare back at us. If you find yourself reflecting on the tale while you move through your day, remember that myths are social mirrors. Medusa reflects more about us than about any timeless nature of womanhood. She shows us how societies treat transgression and sex and power, how they console themselves with tales of heroes, and how they sometimes punish the wrong parties. The power of that reflection is not to give easy answers but to make the questions unavoidable. So whenever you pass a carving of a monstrous face or notice a fashion logo that uses her stare, let it remind you that images have histories. They are not inert. They carry decisions about who gets to be human, who gets to be monstrous, who gets to be honored, and who gets to be exhibited. Medusa's head, whatever else it is a dense knot of those decisions, and to look at it is to be implicated in their long afterlife. The myth will keep being rewritten because new generations will keep finding new stakes in its patterns. Someone will always find in Medusa a language for injustice, a badge for resistance, or a thrillingly terrible costume. The image will continue to move, to be contested, to be used, and to be loved and feared in turn. That mobility is the truest aspect of her immortality. She is not frozen in stone but vibrantly alive across many lives and many tellings. In that way, Medusa becomes less a monster to be expelled and more a figure to be read and reread, an archetype that demands conversation across time. Her snakes are our questions. Her gaze is the insistence of history that certain human experiences cannot be made invisible by comfort or denial. As long as people ask hard questions about power, and as long as artists keep needing images to speak with, Medusa's face will have work to do. So when you think of her now, imagine not a single dreadful face, but a whole gallery of faces answering and contradicting each other, the ancient terrors, the Renaissance relief, the modern reclaiming, the commercial appropriation, the scientific borrowing, the poetic consolations, and the political provocations. Together they form a chorus of human responses to what it means to be seen, punished, or recognized. That chorus keeps the myth alive and generous in its capacity to surprise. Leaving Medusa in stone would be too easy. Her story is about motion and transformation even when it celebrates stillness. Her legacy is not merely ancient petrifaction but an ongoing process of reimagining, remembering, and rewriting. And in that ongoing process, each new telling is a small reversal of the old power that once made her into an object. The act of telling restores agency to listeners and readers who can choose to see Medusa differently. Listen to her story in museums and in essays, on film and in fashion, in scientific taxonomy and in political debate, and you will hear the same refrain. The past speaks to the present in images that refuse to be resolved. Medusa remains a test case for how we handle difficult inheritance. Do we accept the old punishment and its logic, or do we interrogate who wrote the rules? The ways we answer shape the future of the myth. There is no end to this conversation because each age poses new questions and finds new uses for ancient images. Medusa's fate, once a simple moral about gaze and punishment, becomes a palimpsest of meanings layered on top of one another. The more you look, the more layers you will find. That density is not obstruction, it is richness, and it is why the legend will go on being told and retold in ways that constantly surprise and sometimes unsettle us. And so the Gorgon's legacy teaches a vital lesson about cultural endurance. Images survive because they are adaptable and because they speak to perennial human concerns. Medusa is more than a mythic monster. She is a mirror, a tool, and a rebuke. Study her, and you study the dynamics of seeing and being seen, of power and justice, of punishment and sympathy, of art and politics. Her story is a long one because the ideas it contains are still more urgent than ever. Her story keeps echoing because it's still ours. Subscribe and write in the comments if what stays with you more is her courage to defy power or the pain that made her unforgettable.